Good morning, afternoon, if it is applicable. Good day, everyone. You are obviously with us here at the CSO Forum, the PAP, Pan-African Parliament Civil Society Forum, and you are most welcome. My name is Frans Viljoen. I'm the Director of the Center for Human Rights, and I will make a small introduction and welcoming before handing the floor to Bonolo Makgale, our moderator for the first session. So let me first just say welcome to everyone here this morning, this afternoon, civil society organizations, CSOs, who have been participating in the forum, and new ones. We obviously welcome you and wish that you would also see the opportunity of joining the CSO forum on a more permanent basis, academics included, members of the PAP, Pan-African Parliament, MPAPs, MPAPs, selected ones who are hopefully able to join us, members of the Secretariat of the PAP, and also members of the media. Certainly we hope that you are also able to join us today. And our resource persons who will lead us into the discussion, welcome to you all. Just maybe a short word of logistics. This event is live streamed on the Center's YouTube page and Facebook, and it will be recorded and made available after the event, and will also be on the Twitter disseminated. The event is done from the Center for Human Rights, but really in collaboration as an event of the CSO Forum. So a very brief word about the CSO Forum. It was established in 2019, and the aim is maybe threefold. It is to get acquainted civil society organizations better with the Pan-African Parliament. I think that is a great need in the first place. Secondly, then, to also explore ways in which civil society organizations can better work with and access the PAP and find avenues of collaboration with the Pan-African Parliament. And thirdly, really, is to create a critical mass of NGOs, CSOs that can work together and form collaborations among themselves in order to explore those possibilities of essentially making more meaningful the Pan-African Parliament in the lives of Africans, people around the continent. In that framework, we also welcome the members of the steering committee of the CSO Forum, in particular the chairperson, Ms. Colette Letloyane. And perhaps here I can just draw our attention also to the program that Colette will do the concluding remarks for us. We trust that she is able to join us and then also will be involved in the program. That's a small adjustment. So thank you very much to all of you, and thanks to our team in the center. The center has a number of units. One of the units in the Center for Human Rights is the Democracy and Civic Engagement Unit, headed by Bonolo Makgale, and ably assisted here by Tariro Sekeremai. We thank them very much for their work on this. We also would want you to explore the toolkit that we have created around civil society access to the Pan-African Parliament, and that is located on the Center's webpage. If you go to the webpage, you go to the unit, the Democracy and Civic Engagement Unit, and you'll find, and hopefully find it useful. It's in English, French, and Portuguese, so pass that on, and it also now appears in the chat box. So thank you for that. It's a guide that can assist you afterwards. Going then perhaps to the program, I draw your attention to the fact that we will, in a sense, look at the PAP engagement CSOs. We'll have three interventions, and after that, we have thematic interventions. So my remarks to open us up would relate to those three themes that we consider. I think the first theme that we consider in terms of our first session, the PAP engagement with CSOs, is Mr. Jegan Johnson from OSISA, will speak about what recently happened. I think it is inescapable that our discussion today must make reference to and reflect on the, let's call it disgraceful conduct, unfortunate conduct of some members of the PAP in the recent Fifth Parliament's opening. That, I think, was very unfortunate. We hear so little about the PAP, and then when we do, it is in the context of this very unfortunate and I think personalized, petty political context. On my side, I hope that despite the unfortunate nature of the event, it could propel us and be a turning point in two directions. First turning point, we hope, is that the media, especially the South African media, could be more consistently involved in covering the PAP, because what we see here is maybe a very sensationalized portrayal of incidents that capture the immediate attention, but not a sustained attempt at exposing, looking at what the PAP is supposed to do and what it has done. The second turn, I hope, could be to greater accountability. Accountability for what the PAP has been able to accomplish on a basis that reflects not on these petty personal politics, but on what the mandate is and what has been achieved. Let us not forget that the Pan-African Parliament is certainly the AU organ with the highest amount of AU funding. In the AU budget, more than 18 million US dollars annually is devoted to the PAP. That is much more than, for example, the African Union's human rights institutions, including the African Court. So what has been the benefits to the citizenry, to us all, the Africans who make up the African Union? There has been some media discussion about South Africa's contributions to the Pan-African Parliament in the context of what happened recently, but I think we should more broadly look at the AU's own location of the PAP within its own framework, financially and otherwise. The second topic there would be looking at the Malabo Protocol. I think we often hear issues and expectations about how things may turn to be different if the Malabo Pan-African Parliament Protocol would enter into force. And we will hear and discuss this further. But I think that it's also good to remember and remind ourselves that one of the big differences that explicitly is provided for in the Malabo Protocol is the adoption of model laws. But at the same time, we know that the Pan-African Parliament, as it stands, has been able to adopt model laws. So my urging would be for us all as civil society organizations to further advance, further drive, further put on the agenda of the PAP where we can, model laws on topics that are important and can lead to influence and changes at the domestic level. The second element of the PAP protocol that I think we also can already pay our attention to is that of the election, the direct election of the members of the Pan-African Parliament, as opposed to the nomination by states from the existing parliamentarians. There is, I think, and argue, nothing that would preclude at the national level states to institute, even without the PAP protocol having entered into force, to institute a system of direct election for members of the Pan-African Parliament. So that's one thing I think that we as civil society can also advocate and push for. The third of our first session items would be reflections on the resolutions and recommendations of the Pan-African Parliament. And I think it's good because as much as we critique and criticize, and the impression is that the Pan-African Parliament has perhaps accomplished very little, we should take seriously the products, the work of its labors, and look and analyze and see to what extent these already contribute to various discourses and make a difference somehow at the national level. But in this regard, I also think that we accept that to a large extent, not having been endowed with legislative powers, that the PAP is a talk shop. But I always like to say it should at the very least be a talk shop that matters. It should be talking about matters that matter to Africans, and it should speak in a way that its words and sentiments are heard and impactful. Issues that may serve very well on the PAP agenda would, for example, be, and I speak as a human rights practitioner and professional, for example, tabling the human rights bodies reports, the annual activity reports of the African Court, the African Commission, Committee on the Rights of the Child, emphasizing, looking at decisions where violations had been found against states, and using the platform of the Pan-African Parliament to draw attention, in particular, to non-compliance by states, so that hopefully both the citizenry will be better informed, and perhaps potentially make more of their own popular power at the national level, but that the members of parliament, when they return or act at the national level, they could also be better informed and push for the implementation of these decisions. The last point here is that I think the PAP could also be used as a forum to look into the election of African Union officials, judges, commissioners, committee members, and so on, that the CVs could on a consistent basis be shared, made public, and discussed at the level of the Pan-African Parliament. Doesn't mean that the Pan-African Parliament becomes the electing body, but it would just enhance a discourse of inclusion and transparency about how decision-making takes place at the African Union level. Because that is what the PAP protocol promises: effective inclusion of Africa's people in the decision-making processes of the African Union. So let us put that promise to the test as civil society through our discussions today and through our future engagement. So once again, welcome to you all. We really appreciate you being here. I thank our team, Bonolo, and our technical team, Yolanda and Taruna, everyone who made this possible. And I hand over the chair, the moderatorship, to Bonolo, please. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Prof. Good morning from a very cold Pretoria. Thank you so much for joining us. I looked at the list of participants and we have a very good representation from across the continent. I just want to apologize. I saw on the comment section that there were people from Francophone countries that have asked for translation. We apologize that we don't have French translation. My name is Bonolo Makale. As Prof has said, I head up the Democracy and Civic Engagement Unit of the Center for Human Rights, and the Center's project with the Pan-African Parliament is one of our big projects in the unit. And so to begin, I'd like to just mention a few rules of engagement to make this conversation more productive and engaging. Should you have any questions, please place them in the chat box. And once all speakers have had their 10, then they'll be allowed to engage with your questions. And so moving on to the content of the session, what we saw come out very clearly in the happenings of the past few weeks at the 4th ordinary session of the Pan-African Parliament was the interaction and the need to balance politics and law. We saw issues that plagued the continent's institutions, such as legitimacy, accountability, lack of constructive dialogue, resisting institutional reforms, and the fault lines affecting African unity coming to the forefront. The balance of legality, respecting the rule of law and politics will be necessary for the future of the Pan-African Parliament as a body that aspires to become a continental legislature. While we are addressing institutional reform issues and the discussion of balancing legality and politics, we cannot, and Prof alluded to this, we cannot leave out the issue of the slow ratification of the Malabo Protocol. This remains one of the areas that highlights the resistance to institutional reform and the lack of political will of member states of the Pan-African Parliament. The ratification of the Malabo Protocol will be essential to improving the Parliament's effectiveness and further establishing and entrenching the institution's legitimacy. And I think it's important for us as civil society to continue to lobby for the ratification of the Malabo Protocol. Although the PAP is faced with issues of legitimacy and challenges of reform resolutions and recommendations passed by the Pan-African Parliament on thematic matters, including human rights, peace and security, development, and continental integration, have played an essential role in addressing these issues on the continent. We have seen these interventions in countries like Uganda, Chad, and the Central African region, just to mention a few. And the PAP has also taken strides towards protecting vulnerable groups in Africa, such as persons with albinism, seen in the resolution passed in 2018, which gave more concrete measures on protecting the rights of persons with albinism. And the Pan-African Parliament has also begun exploring the adoption of model laws and seeks to do so in areas such as policing and disability in Africa. Now, civil society is the primary means through which the Pan-African Parliament can forge a link between itself and domestic constituencies in the African continent. Meaningful engagement between civil society and the Pan-African Parliament will allow for inclusivity, representation, meaningful and beneficial intervention to the people that we represent. And so this is a critical moment and a call of action for us as civil society to rise to the occasion of calling for accountability and reform for the benefit of our members and the continent at large in our engagement with regional bodies such as the Pan-African Parliament and the African Union. The attention drawn to the PAP around its internal function accentuates its failings to be a forum for democratic deliberation that impacts the lives of African people. The recent events also gives rise to a call to action for the Pan-African Parliament to remedy its internal struggles, both political and legal, so that the Parliament can continue to strive towards effectiveness and carry itself as the ideal Parliament of the continent, espousing values of integrity, respect of democratic processes and African unity. And so the session will reflect on the implications of what happened at the fourth ordinary session, and will also look at the importance of the ratification of the Malabo Protocol and its implications to the continent. And lastly, we'll look at the resolutions and recommendations that PAP have adopted over the years since its inception. We have 3 experts, and I will give each of them 10 to 12 minutes to make their submissions, and I'll open up the floor for questions. So I'll hand over to Jagan from OSISA's African Regional Office. Jagan, you've got 10 to 12 minutes to make your submission, and then we'll move on to Dr. Ncube, who is a senior lecturer at University of Johannesburg. And then we'll move over to Professor Bonolo from Botswana University. And after the 3 of them have made their presentations, we'll take questions. So I want to encourage you, while they're making presentation, please put your comments and your questions in the chat box. Jagan, I'll hand over to you.
Thank you very much, Bonolo. I hope you can hear me clearly. So I'll just quickly get on with it. And again, thanks for inviting me to this very important session. I think, as Prof had said earlier in his introduction, it goes without saying, and I think we all agree, that the opening of the fourth ordinary session of the 5th Parliament of PAP by the Ghanaian President Nana Akufo-Addo on the 24th of May was probably the only thing that went well with the continental parliamentary session, as we saw, because everything was downhill from there. So let me quickly maybe deal with the issues at hand. I mean, what was the cause of this? What were the MPs on the various sides of the aisle demanding? And why did we get to this? If you recall, the Southern Caucus had been calling for regional representation through a process of the rotation, right? They demanded that the rotational leadership should be based on the African Union rules, and which must be introduced forthwith, immediately, for those upcoming presidential elections for the PAP Bureau, which were to be held in that May session. And their candidate was Chief Charumbira, who was then the acting president of PAP. The Eastern and Western Caucasus went in a different direction. They wanted to have the direct voting system that has basically obtained since inception of PAP in March 2004. And obviously the Southern Caucasus have cried foul because they felt that they've been marginalized. In this particular session, the Malian MP, Honorable Aïssata Haidara Cissé, who was before this elected as the 2nd Vice President of the Pan-African Parliament in May of 2018, was seen to be perhaps the strongest contender for the vacant post of the PAP presidency. But again, to make matters worse and more complicated, as this was happening over that weekend prior to the 31st of May, on that Sunday, we got news that ECOWAS had suspended Mali for the second coup that has taken place in that country. Nevertheless, it took a few days before the AU followed and suspended Mali, which meant automatically that her candidacy was fallen away because Mali could no longer send representation to the Pan-African Parliament. Nevertheless, there was still another candidate, Albino Matom Ayol Abong, who's from South Sudan, who was supposedly had the full backing of the Eastern Caucus. So obviously the complexities did not ease as we were now heading closer towards that Monday fiasco that the whole world saw. But again, let me just go back and say, in all fairness, I think the South did have a right to feel aggrieved, given that since its inception, the organ has had 5 presidents, none of whom were from the South nor from the North. So you'd see that Gertrude Mongella was the first PAP president in 2004, then Idris Musa in 2009, then Bethel Amadi in 2012, and obviously Roger Dang. 2015, he did 2 terms, and then in his acting capacity, Chief Cherumbira came in and was acting until that particular point in time. To make matters worse, I think the contradictory and confusing reports, policy, or legal correspondences on the matter of rotation from the 26th to the 31st of May that numbered nothing fewer than 6 different correspondence around this issue that in some instances even contradicted each other, did not help matters, as it gave cause for each side feeling entitled to their own interpretation as being the correct one. I will not obviously go into detail on the correspondences, but safe to say that they were from the legal counsel and the secretariat of the Pan-African Parliament. But what I would like to bring attention to, however, is the op-ed that was penned by Advocate Madassa. Madassa is a person that I know very well during his time as the PAP of Clark, and we worked together over a number of years. And he said, and I'm going to quote him, that the PAP elections are conducted only according to the rules of procedure as stipulated in the protocol establishing the PAP. Rotation of the PAP presidency is not yet codified in the rules of procedure to make it binding. Notwithstanding, because PAP was still orderly in the past, rotation was followed by consensus, which led to the East, West, and Central holding the presidency without incident. I should hasten to add that rotation is also followed within a region when nominating candidates for a bureau position. Consequently, in the southern region, Zimbabwe, Namibia, Mozambique have held positions of vice president in the bureau. In order to regulate rotation previously to ensure respect for the principle, we stipulated that the rules could be amended if there were 2/3 majority of its members present and voting. He goes on to state, the PAP up until now has not yet amended the rules to make rotation binding despite having bureau numbers from our region. He concludes by saying that the chaos was preventable and states further that the role of the AU Legal Council is advisory and not binding on any organ of the AU, especially the Parliament. The only power they have over PAP is regarding litigation, which is centralized in their office. PAP cannot be sued or sue on its own, but through the AU Legal Council office. Their opinion on legal matters does not have an overriding force over the internal rules of procedure of the PAP. I'll end his statement there. So as things stand now, we see that there's no bureau at the Pan-African Parliament. There are no ad hoc committees. All committees have been dissolved. Political structures have been dissolved. And the clerk will oversee the institution as the administrative head only. So there'll be no political policy decisions that are going to be made, and even to a certain degree programmatic. So in essence, there's nothing going on as things stand. Things are in abeyance. However, an extraordinary summit, we hope, will be held to normalize the situation, but this is unlikely to happen before October, if it happens at all. So the cost of not finalizing this session with the new leadership has had major economic implications, I think, on the AU, and partly maybe the RSA budget as well, as it is estimated for every session to cost $1 million. So $1 million has largely gone down the drain, over this fighting and the public spectacle that we saw starting on the 31st Monday and into Tuesday and Wednesday. So let me maybe quickly focus on PAP's regression briefly and why we got to this level. Number one is leadership. PAP has been handicapped for a while with every successive presidency or bureau regressing at every stage. The last of which I think was under the presidency, certainly of Honorable Roger Kododang from Cameroon, the Central Caucus, who took, the presidency in 2015. And I think during his tenure, it's no secret, there have been allegations of corruption, abuse of office, maladministration, and basically just general incompetence that has engulfed the institution at both the level of the bureau and also the level of the secretary. I think also because of that, a culture of fear crept into the situation. There's someone. Okay, I think a culture of fear has crept into the institution during this period. CSOs were being prevented from addressing burning issues at national level, most especially in countries to which bureau members belonged. So I'll give you a brief example. Cameroon crisis was raging in 2019. We fought very hard to try and get Cameroon on the agenda on the Justice and the Human Rights Committee, and obviously this was quashed. Precisely because the president of the PAP at the time, Roger Dang, was from Cameroon and belonged to the ruling party. I think, this has not augured well for CSOs finding a safe space to basically ventilate burning issues, which is the mandate of PAP, one of the mandates at least of PAP. Because prior to this travesty, PAP was until that time one of the few platforms where civil society could safely ventilate issues that other Pan-African institutions, traditionally shied away from. That's the first thing. The second issue as to why we got to this level, obviously, without it, it's nobody's fault, which was the COVID pandemic. You'd see that the effectiveness of PAP was largely undermined by the COVID pandemic because, much like most institutions, because PAP was effectively closed down from, for almost 18 months. It last sat as a plenary at the end of 2019 and remained non-functioning for almost 18 months. And during this period, almost 198 seats out of the 270 had changed occupants, with most AU member states having undergone elections in that period. This meant that the Pan-African Parliament was going to get new membership, leadership, and the composition. And all these were unresolved issues due to, as I said, the initial poor leadership, the issues of the fact that they weren't able to get their house in order, and also the acrimony and the growing distrust that was happening along, based on personalities and also regional geographies. So again, just to conclude, the next steps, and I see this debacle that the entire African citizenry had witnessed, and as they say, this revolution was definitely being televised. There were no two ways about that. But I think it's an opportunity. I think it's an opportunity for us to look at course correction, to press a reset button, to ensure that we support PAP and basically strengthen and elevate its mandate. So I think there are various pathways to this. The first thing is the internal changes. I think the number one thing is to make sure that we don't sweep this incident under the carpet. We need to ensure that the violations of Rule 40, which is the conduct of PAP MPs, is investigated. What happened on the 31st of May should never be allowed to be repeated. I think PAP MPs found to be in violation of Rule 40, which were a great many of them, obviously, must be reprimanded and publicly shamed. The second thing, again, I think the working methods of PAP, it's an opportunity now for us to push for the need to revisit some of the rules of procedure. I understand that a compendium suggesting that over 30 rules needed revisiting has been drafted, and if adopted, PAP could be more effective and also more efficient. The plenary has, in principle, I understand, agreed to amend. And also the Rules Committee, I also understand, is working on the zero draft for this. So I think we should encourage them to expeditiously push this to ensure that PAP is fit for purpose once more. The third thing internally is the issue of leadership. I think we as citizens, and particularly civil society organizations working with Pan-African institutions, in particular with the Pan-African Institution, must be inquisitive and be also proactive to basically, probe into the leadership, that we're getting, and endeavor to scrutinize them and do so, systematically and consistently. Because as we have seen, poor leadership has in no small measure contributed to the demise of PAP. I think on the external aspects of it, there's one broad pathway that we need to look at, which is the revised protocol, which is again mentioned as the Malabo Protocol, which is the revised protocol on the Pan-African Parliament, which designates the institution as the legislative organ of the AU, albeit limited legislation and model rules. I think we should push for the remaining ratification numbers needed to bring this into force. Sorry. So thus far, as you know or may not know, 13 states have ratified. We need another 14 more to get the required 27. And I don't think this is a difficult task to achieve. We've done this in more difficult and stringent circumstances under the African Charter on Democracy, Elections and Governance, ACDEC, whereby we put together with PAP the 11 before 2011 campaign, largely led by civil society, supported by the Pan-African Parliament, with champions within the Pan-African Parliament. And we were able to get, the 11 ratifications in under a year. And so I think if we could have done it then, there's no excuse now, given the urgency and also the visibility, although not so positive, of what had happened in PAP, for us to basically push for this as a strategic entry point to try and make PAP a stronger, better, more credible, and more representative in elevating the voices of the African citizenry. Thank you very much. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Jagan. So you mentioned political leadership, and I think that's one of the issues that have really led to the mess that we see at PAP. And just before I hand over to Dr. Ncube, I just want to hear your thoughts that while political leadership has constantly been one of the issues that we see at the Pan-African Parliament, so with now PAP technically not having the leadership because the bureau had to be dissolved for elections, with the events that took place in the past week, do you see, will they have any impact in how PAP, conducts its business going forward, especially between this period and maybe because they're hoping that they will run elections in August. So what happens between now and August, October, given that the institution itself, it already has political leadership issues, and even just the secretariat itself and its effectiveness in governing this institution. What should we expect to see unfold in the next couple of months before the PAP sits again?
Well, I think we should expect a few surprises. Number one, on the candidature side, it's interesting. The way that you can choose a candidate, I mean, anybody can put themselves up, and I believe it's something like, it's hours anyway. It's either 4 hours or 9 hours before the closing of the vote to put themselves forward as candidates, which is very different from the way especially the AUC, for instance, chooses its candidates. I mean, that's a very long and protracted, goes through the caucuses, goes through the recs and whatever. This is very different. And so because, there's already a vacancy, as we see, so we're not going to see the same candidate standing, I don't think. Certainly Mali is not going to be there, that's for sure. So other candidates may creep up. That's the first thing. Other candidates from the South may also creep up. That's the other thing. I think for sure, the rotational issue, may not be resolved. Because remember, if we're saying that 2/3 majority have to change the rules of procedure, and they haven't met yet, they're going to have to meet, and they're going to have to go through the elections under the old rules to be able to now again. So whatever certain sections of the Pan-African Parliament are looking for drastic changes, it's likely not to happen. So we're going to go through the normal channel, the normal change. I think the third thing also is the possibility that the session may not happen in South Africa. They may try to push it to another country for the sake of neutrality. I'm hearing talk of that. And so, that would also have some implications, because if you move it, what are you going to do to a certain section that are heavily leaning towards the South, including the Southern Caucus themselves? Are we going to start seeing some boycotts and saying that, okay, we're not going to go? And what does that mean for the numbers? Would they be able to get, there are all sorts of implications on that. And also, if the boycott does happen and they decide to now continue with the elections as they have it, it's not only going to affect the Bureau, the leadership at the Bureau level, which is the apex of leadership of PAP, is going to affect leadership across all the committees. Because remember, they have to go through elections right the way across the board. And so, would that be a wise thing to happen? We don't know. So I think the way this is navigated, the way we negotiate this, we need to be extremely pragmatic. We need to also be even-handed. And also we need to at least have the benefit of foresight to basically look at the far-reaching implications in the decisions that we take, and not be emotional, not be angry, and not to take knee-jerk reactions. And also not to ensure that this is, an issue of my way or the highway. I mean, we need to do it properly. It has to be done within the rules. But at the same time, I think there has to be some diplomatic maneuverings to try and at least reach the compromise to ensure that we are all in this together, and then this acrimony that happened in Midrand does not basically carry over into the next session, whether it's in another country or back to Johannesburg, Midrand, as we move forward. And so basically, those are the unintended consequences that we see. But finally, on the leadership side, I think for us, there's nothing stopping us from starting the scrutiny as civil society and as citizens, and basically delve into who these candidates are. What have they done in their national parliaments? What have they done to basically alleviate and amplify the voices of the marginalized, the voices of women, the voices of youth? What have they done to promote popular participation, sound democratic practice? What have they done to promote transparency? Have they undermined it? Are they worthy of that title? And do they have the capacity and the ability to basically take that forward in its hour of need and in this very doubtful period where such ugly scenes were played out in full public view? Thanks.
Thanks, Jagan. I have a few questions for you, but I'll ask them later on. Just one around rules of procedure, particularly with what happened with COVID-19. I mean, we saw a few organs of the African Union made exceptions and changes and met last year, but the Pan-African Parliament couldn't do that because the rules of procedures were not amended. But we can talk about that later because we are running behind. So I'm just going to invite Dr. Ncube, who will be looking at the Malabo Protocol. And I think for me, Dr. Ncube, it will be interesting also to see how you reflect on the protocol and its implications to the election processes and the appointment of the Pan-African Parliament membership, and what that would look like for this continental parliament that is meant to encourage participation and representation of ordinary African citizens. So yeah, I'll hand over to you for 10 minutes to give your reflections. Thank you, Zay.
Thank you, Bonolo. Good morning to you, and good morning to everybody on the call, and good morning to those who are joining us via YouTube as well as the Center's Facebook page. I'm just going to share a few reflections on the protocol, of course. And as we know that currently the Pan-African Parliament operates within the confines of the protocol to the treaty establishing the African Economic Community relating to the Pan-African Parliament. And for ease of reference and for purposes of this conversation, I'll refer to this as the CERT protocol. And that which is the subject of our conversation and our future permutations is the protocol to the Constitutive Act of the African Union relating to the Pan-African Parliament. And again, for ease of reference, I'll refer to this as the Malabo Protocol. Now, of course, we all have an interest in what the Malabo Protocol will introduce, but its ratification and its coming into force, as far as I'm concerned, will have three overarching contributions. And the first is a demonstration of a political will by the African Union. And this is so because generally the AU does not enjoy a good reputation. In his introduction, Prof did indicate that, you know, there are some accusations that the Pan-African Parliament is a glorified talk show, and one tends to hear that a lot. And post the fracas that happened in Parliament last week, I was listening to several radio stations, and people were calling in, questioning even the utility of the Parliament itself, and whether or not it's contributing something significant in light of the funds that are spent on it. So because the Malabo Protocol has certain things that it seeks to introduce, that will be quite a good move in the right direction. That will obviously be seen as a good move from the part of the AU and a demonstration of political will that indeed the organization is prepared to try and push the Pan-African Parliament towards full legislative powers. But the second bit is that when the protocol is ratified and it takes effect, it then moves the conversation, because you and I are here today and we're talking about its possible ratification and eventually coming into effect. But more important for me, the moment that it has been ratified and it has come into effect, then we move that conversation to talking about the code on direct election. Because when you look at Article 5.3 of the Malabo Protocol, it tells us that even when it comes into effect, members of the Pan-African Parliament will still be elected by the legislative bodies in their states or any such organ within their state. And that will prevail until such a time that a code has been developed for direct election. So if the protocol comes into effect, then our conversation will then turn to the development of that code, because remember, what you and I have an interest in is having a Pan-African Parliament with full legislative powers. Now, right now, one can be forgiven for thinking that perhaps the parliamentarians view their presence or their membership to the parliament as a side hustle, so to speak, because they are members of their national legislative bodies and they do this as and when they are called upon to do that. Now, of course, we are all encouraged when we look at and see the contestation that happened as far as the presidency is concerned, because it also gives us an idea that perhaps a sense that they also take their role in the Pan-African Parliament seriously. So that for me will be the second significant importance of the coming into effect of the Malabo Protocol, that we move our conversation to talking about the development of the code for direct election. Then, of course, the final one, which is the obvious change, would be those changes that the protocol will introduce. And these are quite numerous, some of them quite important. And as Jagan alluded to, we only have 13 ratifications at the moment. And Article 23 tells us that the protocol will only come into effect 30 days after the deposit of the instruments of ratification by with the chairperson of the commission by simple majority. So we simply need is it 13 or 14 more to get to 27? Forgive my mathematics. And then the protocol comes into effect. Now, Jagan spoke to us and gave us a good background in relation to the fracas that we witnessed last week. And at the center of that was the rotation of the presidency. Now, when the 2014 protocol comes into effect, one of the things that it prescribes is that the presidency shall be held on a rotational basis amongst the 5 regions. And in addition to the presidency, it also tells us that even with the deputies, there'll be a seniority, so to speak, that one is the first deputy president, the one is the second, the third, and the fourth, and then that again is allocated in accordance with the regional representation. So it will be quite important because when it comes into effect as well, it then addresses the issues and eliminates, of course, the sins such as those that we saw last week. And the other important thing that perhaps I should make mention of is women representation. And I think Prof mentioned this in his introduction as well, that when right now under the third protocol, the requirement is that they be a single woman on the 5 representatives of each state. And the 2014 protocol says instead of 1, we need 2. And you cannot be accredited if your delegation does not meet that requirement. So this is important because obviously there are issues with women representation in Africa. There are issues with just the perception that some societies still have about the contributions and the input that women can bring to the table as far as governance is concerned. So this is quite a major change. It's just an addition of 1 from 1 to 2, of course, but it's an important change as far as the trajectory that African governance is moving towards. Now, another thing that I thought I should mention is the requirement under Article 20 that the commission chairperson must present a report on the activities of the commission at least once during the term of the Pan-African Parliament. Now, we are not told what the purpose of this presentation would be, but I would like to think that obviously the Pan-African Parliament will then be in a position to engage with that report and actually question what it is that the commission has undertaken and whether or not that advances the objectives and aims of the African Union generally. And I must say that I think it was in 2018, sorry, at one of its sittings, Julius Malema was at pains to actually indicate to the president of the Pan-African Parliament at the time that what he had presented did not suffice to be termed a report of the president, because he had simply said, oh, by the way, I went to Algeria, I went to Tanzania, and I went to Uganda. And that did not include detail as far as the objectives of the Pan-African Parliament were concerned and what he ought to have achieved through those visits. So this will be important as well, because when the chairperson of the commission appears and makes the presentation, then there can be that engagement, and then the two organs, can at least have that engagement. And that also applies to the assembly chairperson, who also has to deliver a speech at the inaugural meeting of the PAP's new term. Again, this is important because the article tells us that this should be on the state of the African Union. Where are we? What is it that we are doing? And where does the AU see itself in the next 2, 5, 10 years and so forth? So these are important for inter-organ engagement. And then, of course, Bonolo just mentioned now the issue of direct membership and the election of parliamentarians. Now, even if the Malabo Protocol comes into effect, there will still not be direct election of parliamentarians. This is because Article 5 tells us that the parliamentarians will be elected by their national legislative organs. So they are not directly elected by the people, but they are elected by the legislative organs in their states. However, the biggest change will be that it then tells us that these will not be members of their national legislative bodies. And this is important, as I said, in relation to number 2 on my list of important contributions. They should understand their role to be advancing the objectives of the Pan-African Parliament. The preamble to the 2014 protocol, the AU Charter, and so forth. Because when they are members of their national legislative bodies, I can be forgiven, and so can you, for thinking that they view their presence in PAP as a side hustle, as I said, and they don't attach as much importance to its business. And again, as I indicated earlier, that most importantly, as far as election is concerned, is that when the protocol comes into effect, we are told that then there'll be a code that has to be developed for direct election of the parliamentarians. So this will be important, as I said earlier, that once the protocol comes in effect, then our conversation and the engagement of civil society organizations, also their focus changes from let's ratify this and do this to, okay, we have this now in force. Can we have the conversation about developing a code on direct election? And as Prof said, I would like to pose this as a question as well, that is there anything at the moment that precludes member states of the African Union directly electing parliamentarians? So whenever you're going to an election, you also call for nominations for people that want to stand for appointment or election to the Pan-African Parliament. So I think it's something that we can apply our mind to. And then, of course, the issue of the model laws. Now, currently, the Pan-African Parliament is already drafting and proposing model laws. So there's not really much that this draft model laws inclusion as far as Article 8 is concerned is going to change. However, what maybe we must think about is the relevance of those model laws in the absence of a provision that prescribes that they are binding laws, or that, you know, maybe after a certain number of years or a certain period, they have to be made law. So what's their value as far as moving the African unity agenda forward? What is their value as far as the human rights agenda in Africa is concerned? And what is their value generally to member states? Do they take them seriously? Is there a mechanism in place or that can be put in place to ensure that conversations are had in member states as far as applying their minds to these model laws? Now, I must state that one of the other things that I found quite important is the reference to the African diaspora, as well as just people outside of Africa, but of African origin, and their involvement in the affairs of the African Union through the Pan-African Parliament. Now, this is important because, remember, at the heart of the Pan-African Parliament is the participation of Africans generally. Hence, the accusation that in the absence of full legislative powers, then the PAP does not serve a purpose. But of course, in conclusion, I must just indicate that this is going to be a gradual process. We are not suddenly going to wake up with a Pan-African Parliament that is endowed with legislative powers. But of course, that is why we're having platforms such as these, where we can have these conversations and ask questions about what is it that can be done to ensure, of course, the ratification of protocols, and post their ratification and coming into effect, moving to the next stage to ensure that ultimately the Pan-African Parliament has full legislative powers and as a result will serve a purpose. So I think for the sake of time, I'll stop here. Over to you, Chairperson.
Thank you, Dr. Ngube. There's something that you mentioned that this looks like a side hustle for MPs. There's been an accusation that they come to Midrand and go shopping at Mall of Africa using the African Union money. And I'm wondering if, I don't know whether this is something that they have now, or maybe the protocol will enforce it. Just an obligation to make sure that matters of the Pan-African Parliament find expression in their National Assembly. Are there currently any accountability regulatory mechanisms and frameworks that ensures that members of the Pan-African Parliament take matters that are discussed at the PARP to their National Assembly? And again, the slow ratification of the protocol could be one example to say, why isn't that members of the Pan-African Parliament aren't encouraging their state to ratify the protocol? So I'm wondering if there are existing regulatory mechanisms, or whether the protocol would, the ratification of the protocol will enforce that.
Not that I'm aware of, but remember, the engagement with member states is an obligation that rests on the Bureau, and it then becomes difficult. Let me put it like that, for a member state's representative to come back and say, oh, by the way, we discussed this and this and this and this, because can they claim to speak for the parliament in that conversation? And my answer is no, they don't. So if it's the Bureau that undertakes the engagements, then it makes it easy, because they carry, they wear the head of the Pan-African Parliament, and they speak on behalf of the Pan-African Parliament. And as I said in my presentation, that in 2018, Julius Malema was challenging the president then on what he had presented as an activities report. And in there, he was saying, I was in the Equatorial of Guinea, I was in Tanzania, I was in this state. And the question was, fine, we are not so much interested in where you went to, but we're interested in the substance of the conversations and with who you spoke and what the outcome was, because your visit has to advance the objectives of the organ. And in doing so, you then tell us that, okay, as far as ratification is concerned, I was in the Seychelles and this is what they gave me as feedback, and maybe their reservations as far as ratification is concerned. So it's not enough that somebody says, I visited this country, but you visited it and then did what? So the engagement with states rests with the Bureau.
Thank you. And just that leads us to our next session. The Center for Human Rights commissioned a study to do an evaluation study to look at the performance of the Pan-African Parliament over the years since its inception, to see how it has performed given the mandate that was placed on them by the African Union. And I think it's important what you're highlighting, that if I always say that if we are to close the doors of the Pan-African Parliament tomorrow, will that make any difference? I don't know. I don't think so. If the president can just go and say, I've been to that country and that country and that country, without really, telling us what is it that he has done, how has their visit ensured that the mandate given to them has been fulfilled. And so I'm going to hand over to Dr. Bonolo briefly to just make similar reflections on the resolutions and recommendations that the Pan-African Parliament has adopted over the years. And we've seen that some of them have not even been implemented. And so that's the key question here, is that why are we gathering? Why is the Pan-African Parliament gathering? If the doors are to be closed tomorrow, will that make an impact in the state of this continent? And hopefully Dr. Bonolo will be able to answer that question for us, given that he did extensive research on the performance of the Pan-African Parliament in the past 16 years. Over to you, Prof.
Good morning, and thank you very much, namesake, Well, I believe that I have taken some time since 2009 reading on the Pan-African Parliament. And I must say that there is a silver lining to what has happened in the previous weeks at the Parliament, in the sense that for the first time in many years, we have witnessed a discussion across the continent on the Pan-African Parliament, a conversation which has never taken place before, a conversation which some of us have always thought it was important and it needed to happen. And therefore, that's why I'm saying it is a silver lining indeed. Despite that, it's something that should not be encouraged. It's something that we didn't expect would ever take place, but somehow it has put forward the parliament to some people to be able to know that there is a parliament in Africa for Africans that is supposed to deal with issues relating to the continent. And in my discussion about the recommendations and resolutions of the Pan-African Parliament, I think one of the most important things to note is the context within which these recommendations and resolutions are adopted and put forward. And that is the powers of the Pan-African Parliament, specifically that it does not have legislative powers, in the sense that it comes across as is usually described as a talk shop, and therefore we shouldn't be expecting that these recommendations and these resolutions have some form of binding effect at all, especially between the parliament and the other organs of the African Union. So I had someone ask me a few days ago about the difference between the recommendations and the resolutions. And I indicated to them that perhaps the difference lies in their utility, in the sense that with recommendations, they are made directly to other organs of the AU and other entities outside the Pan-African Parliament itself. So when we are talking about the recommendations, we are referring to those communications, those issues that the Pan-African Parliament wants to put forward to other organs of the AU or other external actors. And then when we are looking at resolutions somehow are internal decisions somehow that are made within the Pan-African Parliament itself, to say that we want to do 1, 2, 3, 4. We want to put in place a certain measures in order to achieve 1, 2, 3. So, and that is why I said that the difference between resolutions and recommendations perhaps lies in their utility. And to that end, we could say the resolutions have a binding effect on the Pan-African Parliament itself and its internal organs. Whereas the recommendations are somehow in the same fashion as we used to have a conversation about those of the African Commission on Human and People's Rights. Somehow they are encouraging, and states and other entities and other AU organs are not necessarily per se binding on them. So what we also have to acknowledge is that recommendations and resolutions are somehow been used over years by many parliaments in many areas. And that is why the PAP rules of procedure specifically indicates that the parliament is mandated to discuss issues affecting the continent and then to take resolutions on such matters, such that there are various resolutions that have been adopted over the years, touching on various issues, such issues relating to trade, such issues relating to human rights, such issues relating to disability, to children, to HIV, etc., etc. Whilst we acknowledge that the PAP perhaps it is not at a stage where we want it to be, and I recall someone saying that I'm overly optimistic at one point when we were discussing the possibilities that exist with respect to the Pan-African Parliament. We can acknowledge that over time, the Parliament has taken time to discuss issues that are relevant to the problems that we face in Africa, and somehow trying to come up with and to suggest solutions to those problems. So, for example, as I've indicated, we have issues ranging from trade issues, from integration issues to human rights issues, governance, and democracy in Africa. For example, in the study that we are undertaking, we're looking at the contribution of the Parliament to democracy, human rights, and good governance in Africa. We have identified about 38 recommendations on issues of human rights, good governance, and democracy in Africa for the period 2004 to 2019. And I'm saying we have identified because it is possible that we have missed some of the recommendations specific to human rights, good governance, and democracy in Africa. And when you look at those recommendations, as I've indicated, they deal with many issues that perhaps civil society organizations are able to take those recommendations as an advocacy tool to be able to try and encourage governments to say that this is what needs to be done. And then when it comes to resolutions, we have identified about 98 resolutions for the period 2004 to 2019 on issues of human rights, good governance, and democracy in Africa. And a lot can be said about the recommendations and resolutions of the Pan-African Parliament. They speak to ratification of treaties that have been adopted by the African Union, encouraging and asking African states to ratify treaties such as treaties relating to specifically the African Charter on Democracy, Elections, and Good Governance. It is one of the treaties that the Pan-African Parliament specifically went out of its way to adopt resolutions and recommendations that that encourage states to deal with that. As I've indicated, the resolutions and recommendations deal with emerging and important human rights issues in Africa: climate change, HIV/AIDS, women and children's rights, press freedom, poverty eradication, access to water and sanitation, as well as maternal mortality. Those are some of the issues that when you look at the recommendations and the resolutions of the Pan-African Parliament, you are able to see that the Pan-African Parliament was trying through its plenary discussions and through the work of its committees to propose solutions, to lobby for effective implementation of certain measures to address the issues that it has raised. The one thing that we should note is that when you look at, and this is where civil society comes in, when you look at this vast body of resolutions and recommendations, they are there, difficult to have access to some of them until perhaps recently, when now we had the compendium by the Center for Human Rights on the resolutions and recommendations as well as declarations of the Pan-African Parliament. They are not used by many organizations as much as one would have expected that they would be, in the sense that we have seen and we have been unable to identify where these resolutions, where these recommendations have been used for purposes of advocacy, for purposes of research by the academia or other policy organizations or institutions in Africa. And really, there's no explanation why that is the case. Chances are it is because of the fact that they are not as visible as one would have expected and one would want them to be, and accessible as one would want to be when it comes to Africans or to the continent. But what is important also is to note that they are available to civil society, for the civil society to be able to use them for advocacy purposes, and to also appreciate that civil society is important. And when you look at the work of the African Commission, when it started in yesteryears and where it is now, and how the civil society forum and engagement propelled its work somehow and made it sure that it is used. We are hoping that civil society can step in when it comes to the work of the Pan-African Parliament in order to assist in ensuring that the work gets out there. Is it an important institution, the Pan-African Parliament? I believe that it is an important institution. It just depends on whether it was set up to fail or not. An oversight organization or an oversight institution, such as the Pan-African Parliament, or ideally, such as the Pan-African Parliament, it is very, very important insofar as arresting and dealing with issues in Africa that are challenging. The other thing that perhaps is the one thing I should also note is that when you look at the resolutions and the recommendations of the Pan-African Parliament, you find that they mirror each other. Usually, a committee would make a resolution, propose a resolution, and then it is taken to the plenary for discussion, and then the plenary then will make would adopt that particular resolution, and then subsequently, in more instances, in many cases, you find that then there's going to be a recommendation that will follow as well. So, as I've indicated, there is a compendium of resolutions and recommendations and declarations of the Pan-African Parliament that you can access at the center's website. I believe it's there, which will give you an idea on the number of recommendations that have been adopted. Their utility is the one which is a problem, as I've indicated, because of possibly many people not being aware that we have such vast amount of material or material that we can use for the purpose of promoting human rights, good governance, and democracy in Africa. And then finally, civil society organizations can also help push the other AU organs to listen to the Pan-African Parliament. Listen to the Pan-African Parliament in the sense that they should always try as much as possible to adopt and perhaps accept the recommendations by the Pan-African Parliament. what we have noticed so far is that the activity reports of the other AU organs do not necessarily indicate that what the Pan-African Parliament is recommending to them is actually taken into account in their decision-making process. What is just mentioned is that the Pan-African Parliament presented its activity report, and then they continue to deal with issues. So perhaps that is one area where we could encourage, and in our advocacy efforts, try as much as possible to assist the Parliament in getting its voice heard and in getting its work recognized. So I'll stop there, B. I don't know whether I have left out anything. No, I don't think so.
Thank you, Dr. Bonolo. Dr. Ncube needs to dash out to a meeting. I want to apologize. We're running very late. So I'm just going to ask you a question, Dr. Ncube, just before you leave. That to what extent is giving the Pan-African Parliament full legislative powers a feasible endeavor in Africa, given the different legal and political systems on the continent? How easily can these be harmonized?
Of course, as I indicated earlier, that a parliament with full legislative powers is what we all clamor for. That's what we all want. But when all is said and done, we must understand that is going to be a gradual process. And in that process, that's where we're going to address issues to do with precisely what you have asked right now. You know, how do we harmonize the laws in light of the differences that exist amongst the member states? So it's a question that I certainly do not have an answer for, but it's something that people must continue to engage with and raise those questions, you know, where somebody says, okay, but this is how we do things and this is what is proposed. How are we going to find common ground? Because remember, when all is said and done, the intention is to find common ground. And I had Bonolo as one was making reference to, you know, a silver lining, and I tend to agree with him completely, because we are moving towards something, and that movement is painfully slow. Yeah. But we have to keep the faith and know that all the speed humps and all the challenges that come along the way will be addressed as we go, as and when they arise. So I certainly do not have an answer as to how the harmonization will be carried out, but I have no doubt that as Africans, we have the capacity to find that common ground and to have a legislative organ on the continent that makes laws that are binding on all member states of the African Union.
Thank you. Just to reflect on some of the things that Dr. Bonolo has said, I think one of the mandates of the Civil Society Forum is to enhance the capacity of the Pan-African Parliament to fulfill its mandate. And I do want to make the call, of course it's a selfish call because it does impact on my performance here at work, but I do want to make a call to a few of you that are in the room to say that here's an opportunity for us as civil society organizations to really come alongside the Pan-African Parliament. Dr. Bonolo mentioned resolutions and recommendations that have been adopted over the years, and some of them have not been implemented. And here's an avenue for us as civil society organizations to say we have expertise in these different human rights thematic, issues. How do we come alongside and support the different committees of the Pan-African Parliament? Because I think for me, one of the things that are important is it's beyond this kind of gathering, beyond us sitting here, civil society organizations engaging on the Pan-African Parliament. I want to see a space where we are making a contribution to the functioning of the PAP itself. we are making a contribution to the work of the committees. And I think one of the things that have come out quite a lot here, beyond institutional reforms, beyond electoral issues, beyond the ratification of the protocol, there's a lot of avenues here for us. And I think as a people and as civil society, perhaps we should also avail ourselves a lot more and do a lot more to ensure that the Pan-African Parliament does that which is mandated for by the African Union. So I do want to say thank you to my speakers. Thank you to Jagan, and thank you to you, Dr. Ncube. And thank you to Professor Bonolo for availing yourselves. And there's a whole lot more other questions from the participants, but unfortunately we've run out of time. But when we put together the report, we would make sure that those questions are in the report and have been answered. So I will reach out to some of the speakers just to flag some of the questions that have come from the audience. So thank you so much. We are going to move on to another session that will be moderated by one of our partners from Ghana, Mr. Semi Obeng. Semi, I'll hand over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bonolo. Such a great and insightful session you have held with the gentleman. I think that it puts things in amazing context for this next session. As Bonolo has already indicated, my name is Sami Obeng. I'm joining you from Accra. And I'm very happy to be part of this, especially as we will be discussing a topic that goes to complement the discussions that have been held so far. I work with an organization called Parliamentary Network Africa. It's a parliamentary monitoring civil society organization that is seeking to promote open parliament across the continent of Africa. And it is in this context that I'm happy to be moderating this session on parliamentary monitoring and openness. I think that the conversation that has been held so far has brought to the fore the importance of the Pan-African Parliament, and of course, the various national parliaments on our continent that come together to make up the PAP. We have also seen from the presentations so far the amazing prospects that will come up with the PAP if everything goes well, especially with the Malabo Protocol and what have you. For every legislative body, such as the PAP and even national parliaments, that seeks to represent people, that seeks to perform oversight duties, their roles and functions are very critical. And whereas they perform this critical role, it is also important that there is a constant eye on these organizations and bodies, because as representatives of the people, there is the need for some level of checks to be able to know whether they are also playing their roles effectively. And this is where parliamentary monitoring organizations come in. And so in this session, we're going to be talking about the subject of parliamentary monitoring and openness. It is our belief that we'll be able to connect it with the happenings of the recently held PAP session, which obviously is very topical. And like Bonolo said from the very beginning, we cannot do without bringing that into the context of our discussion, particularly also because over the last couple of months, the public relations units of PAP have been playing a very significant role in ensuring that they give some level of visibility to the Pan-African Parliament. This culminated into having some fantastic arrangements towards parliamentary monitoring of parliament through the establishment of a network of well over 100 media people from across the continent who are working towards giving visibility to the PAP in their respective countries, monitoring the things that are going on in the PAP. And it is quite coincidental that in the very year that this group of people decided to, come together and remotely monitor the Pan-African Parliament and to take information out there to their respective nationals, that was when such unfortunate incidents happens. But what has all of this gotten to teach us on the subject of openness, so far as the PAP is concerned, on the matter of monitoring constantly the Pan-African Parliament and working effectively to ensure that things go well. To help me discuss these topics and to look at this session, which will be focusing on the PAP and how it can adopt open parliament's principles of transparency, accountability, citizens' participation, inclusion in its work and practices, of course, in its quest to achieve its core mandate, and also to see how PMOs, parliamentary monitoring organizations, can sustain increased collaborative dialogue with the Continental Parliament and its member parliaments, and also to help enable, foster an enabling environment that would help us monitor the work of national and the regional parliament. I have two distinguished speakers who have joined from various parts of the world to be able to give perspective. Getting some feedback to this subject matter. Okay, the feedback is gone off now. Thank you to the technical team. These two speakers, Theo Shiviru. Theo is the regional lead for Africa and the Middle East on the Open Government Partnership, OGP, and Theo will be providing perspectives on mainstreaming open parliament principles in the work and practices of the Pan-African Parliament. Of course, Theo's presentation will be followed by a presentation from Maria Baron, who is the Global Executive Director for Directorio Legislativo, which is based in Argentina, and also a founding member of the Latin American Network for Legislative Transparency, who will also be sharing reflections on fostering enabling environments for PMOs to monitor national and transnational parliaments on our continent. And so at this point, having introduced and seeing Theo in the room, may I hand over to you, Theo. Thank you very, very much for making time to join us. I saw that you and Maria have both been in the meeting for the first session. And maybe if we could do this because of the want of time within 10 minutes or less, it would be great so that at least we can have some questions coming in. Bonolo, I saw that you wanted to.
Yes. So I know Maria has to leave in the next 25 minutes. So I'm wondering if it's possible for Maria to go first before Theo.
It appears Maria is fine.
I don't want to alter the order. Theo, you can go ahead and then I'll manage.
Okay,
because I think it's good for him to introduce sort of the big space, and then I'll go into the details.
Awesome. So Theo, over to you.
Thank you very much, Sammy, and thank you for inviting me to join. This is the first time that as OGP, as the Open Government Partnership, we are engaging with with the Civil Society Forum for the Pan-African Parliament. So we are really grateful for inviting us. And I think what is really encouraging, really from our side, is seeing the growing partnership between the Pan-African Parliament and civil society, because at the Open Government Partnership, the partnership between state institutions and civil society is the cornerstone of the Open Government Partnership. And for some of you who don't know, the Open Government Partnership is a global partnership of 78 national governments and 76 local governments. And of those, 15 national governments are from Africa and 16 local governments are from Africa. And so the partnership brings together government reformers and civil society leaders to work together with governments to advance the principles of transparency, accountability, and citizen participation. And the partnership, really, this year, it's a very good, is an important year for us, because we are turning 10 years old after we were launched in 2011 at the UN General Assembly by various heads of states, 8 heads of states and civil society. So the partnership between civil society and government is very paramount and very important to us, and it's the cornerstone of our partnership. So we are meeting today for this meeting at a time when the world and Africa are facing a confluence of crises which we think are very important for the Pan-African Parliament, but are also very important for parliaments in general and governments. And these crises that we're seeing are pushing for citizens. Citizens are beginning to push because of this crisis for their voices to be heard, for their opinions to count, and for their experiences to help shape government policies. And I think, citizen voices and citizen experience and creating spaces are some of the founding principles of the Pan-African Parliament to ensure participation of citizens in economic development and participation of citizens in decision-making on the problems and challenges that we are facing as a continent. And I speak of the 4 crises of some of the crises that we are facing as a continent, or as the world. And I would like to highlight 4 of these that are very important, that I think should be at the center of the work that the Pan-African Parliament is doing. The first one is the threat on democracy that we are seeing, especially in Africa. We are seeing the rise of authoritarian practices, which have resulted in the shrinking of civic space and the arresting and the silencing of any dissenting voices to our governments. The second one is the increase of inequality and poverty that we're seeing in Africa because of COVID, but also because of issues like corruption that we're seeing on the continent. The third is the decline in trust between governments and citizens. And I think this year, now in this period of COVID that we are, this trust is at an all-time low because of some of the restrictive measures that we're seeing in a number of our countries. And in many of the countries, citizens are perceiving that governments are disconnected, unresponsive to their needs, and some of them are corrupt, and some of them are captured by special interest groups. And the fourth and most important that we all are grappling with at the moment is the global crisis, the pandemic, the COVID-19, that has caused unprecedented effects on lives and livelihoods. While the global pandemic is here, what the global pandemic has shown us is that it is not only a health and a socio-economic crisis, but also a governance crisis. Our governance systems and our infrastructure in Africa have been tested by COVID-19. And in a number of our countries, they have fell short, with corruption scandals in several of our countries, poor oversight from institutions like Parliament on COVID funds, and also lack of accountability. Now, what the open government approach, anchored in transparency, accountability, participation, and inclusion, offers an alternative that can help to push back and help address some of these crises that I've highlighted. Crisis of the sliding democracy, building trust with citizens, between citizens and government, reduce corruption and inequality, protect citizen lives and livelihoods. And this is done by combining openness and transparency, communication by government and parliamentarians, with the active participation and oversight by citizens, civil society, and other stakeholders to tackle these grave crisis challenges that we are currently facing on our continent. And the Pan-African Parliament and its members, not only the Pan-African Parliament, but also its members, can play a very critical role in advancing these open government approaches, which I think also align with the mandate of the Pan-African Parliament to promote citizen participation, transparent and democratic governance. The Pan-African Parliament, I think, should aspire for openness across its functions and also across all African Parliament. This means full transparency and accountability in the management and operations across core functions and activities of both the Pan-African Parliament, but also of all parliaments on the continent. It also means providing citizens with meaningful access to decision makers and decision-making processes, so that we can build the much-needed trust between Pan-African Parliament, the parliaments of the continent, and citizens themselves. So it was quite interesting that, you know, even in the earlier discussion, that some of these things have also been brought, that, you know, even as parliaments and the Pan-African Parliament needs to deliberate on the pressing issues affecting the continent, parliamentarians need to shape how citizens engage with governments. The Pan-African Parliament needs to shape how citizens can actually engage with itself and how citizens can hold government to account. And above all, very important thing that the Pan-African Parliament needs to look at is how citizen voices become the center of lawmaking, of decision-making, of both the Pan-African Parliament, but also of the African Union and its member states. With that, I would like to suggest 4 priorities for the Pan-African Parliament, ways that they can mainstream open government approaches in its function. The first priority is openness and transparency. The Pan-African Parliament needs to open up to citizens, making the Pan-African Parliament transparent in its processes, in its proceedings, in its decisions, and in its oversight functions. Part of that openness and transparency also means disclosing the budgetary spending of the Pan-African Parliament and empower civil society like yourselves to follow the money, to ensure that so that you can monitor where every penny that goes through the Pan-African Parliament, you can monitor where it's coming from, where it's going, and to ensure that it actually reaches its intended beneficiaries. So I think that an open and transparent Pan-African Parliament connects and empowers citizens, but also builds trust with citizens and civil society. We are seeing some of these measures in parliaments like Cape Verde, in parliaments like Estonia, where parliaments are further improving, institutional, transparency by publishing information of all plenary hearings and committee meetings in machine-readable and citizen-friendly formats. And I think the Pan-African Parliament could take some of these measures, some of these measures to open up to citizens. The second priority, I think, should be the Pan-African Parliament needs to protect citizens from authoritarian practices. I think the Pan-African Parliament is well positioned to build back citizen-centered democracies, to push back restrictive measures that we are seeing across the continent. Protect citizens, protect civic space, protect media freedoms, protect citizens' ability to freely speak, associate, and assemble, so that they're able to monitor as well as hold government to account. Across the continent, a lot of citizens are being silenced. COVID-19 has actually created a pretext for a number of our governments, for example, in Tanzania, in Zimbabwe, in Uganda, to actually silence any dissenting voices. And also, we are seeing in a number of these countries, journalists are being arrested. And I think the Pan-African Parliament, as well as Parliament, can push back on these authoritarian practices. And also, very important, the shutdown of internet and social media. And Nigeria being the latest example that we've all seen where social media has been shut down in Nigeria. And I think the Pan-African Parliament is in a very good position to really push back on that and allow and create spaces for where citizens can freely speak and share, any criticism towards government. The third priority that the Pan-African Parliament needs to focus on is inclusion and ensure the participation of marginalized communities. For far too long, we have seen the voices of women, of youth being sidelined in both the regional and global developmental agenda. And the Pan-African Parliament could be a champion to promote the participation and empowerment of women, youth, and marginalized in all aspects of governance and developmental discussions across the continent on agendas like Agenda 2063 on sustainable development, as well as on issues of government's responses and recovery of COVID-19. It is very important that these voices become the center of decision making at the continental level, but also at the national level. And we are seeing this in a number of our parliaments across, which the Pan-African Parliament can actually take lessons on. For example, in Sierra Leone, where Sierra Leone is working towards greater equity in developing a gender equity checklist for all, for all lawmaking as well as budget processes. And the fourth and final is really on making sure that amplifying the voices of citizens in developmental agendas, but also pushing back on corrupt activities that we are seeing. To date, we have over 100 million that has been flowing into Africa towards COVID-19 response and recovery, but very little is known about how that money has been spent. Very little is known about the loans, the conditions of the loans that African governments are making, the deals that they are making in order to procure the necessary resources for COVID-19. Yet the Pan-African Parliament should be a champion to push back and call for more transparency on these funds, to make sure that we, the citizens of Africa, know where the money is coming from, where the money is spent, and whether the money is actually getting to the necessary beneficiaries. So there's a role that the Pan-African Parliament and help shape, the African Union's policies around issues of around developmental and governance processes, and make sure that corruption and pushing back on corruption becomes a fundamental agenda within that. So in closing, I hope I'm not above time. I think with all these four agendas, for the Pan-African Parliament to be able to achieve these four agendas, they cannot do it alone. They need to build and strengthen the partnerships. And I'm happy that, discussions like this today and the partnerships on the CSO forum of the Pan-African Parliament are the beginning of fostering and building this partnership. Because with these partnerships, we're able to innovate, we're able to share ideas and build policies and build processes that are able to put citizens at the center of all developmental issues, but also, especially now as we deal with COVID, citizen-centric and citizen monitoring processes are quite fundamental to make sure that, our citizens get what is owed to them, but also we make sure that all the resources that are coming into Africa to respond to the COVID-19 get to where they intend to get. The Pan-African Parliament has an opportunity to become the voice of the voiceless. The Pan-African Parliament, together with the African parliaments, have the opportunity to protect citizens and be able to create spaces where citizens can speak freely, share their opinions, share their voices, but also, most importantly, for them to be able to hold the government to account and to make sure that they shape the Africa we want. They can shape the policies, the laws that are coming out of Pan-African Parliament. So I say today in my closing remarks, we need to work together, and we really encourage the Pan-African Parliament to actually champion the open government principles of transparency, accountability, participation, and inclusion. Because with these principles, we are able to make sure that Africa is not the last continent to actually recover from the pandemic. Thank you, Semi. I hope I didn't go over time.
Thank you so much, Theo. No, you didn't. And it's been a great presentation. I am in unison with participants who have made a number of comments in the chat box about how great the presentation has been. And I couldn't agree with you more about the challenges militating against our continent in these times. And of course, your 4 priority suggestions are very succinct, spot on. And I believe that you have created effectively the nexus between how the Pan-African Parliament can play a role in this open parliament process, open government process, and how it connects even to member parliaments. Thank you so very, very much. Now, as we go ahead, if you have any questions, comments, please put them in the chat box. We'll do well to compile them and put them across to our speakers. At this point, and also being mindful a bit about time, I'll give the same amount of time to Maria Baron. Maria has joined us very early in the morning in Buenos Aires. Thank you very, very much, Maria, for joining. Of course, Maria, you have played a very integral role in parliamentary monitoring across the Latin American region, and together with colleague PMOs and civil society organizations, have done a lot of great work in that regard. We want to learn from some of these best practices. And of course, it is important to add that Maria is the global co-chair of the Open Government Partnership, of course, co-chairing with the government of Korea. Maria, over to you.
Thank you, Sami. Thank you, Theo, for your words and remarks. Very thoughtful. In fact, it's very, very early where I'm at right now. But I want to very briefly, I have to say, two or three points, maybe underlining what Theo was saying, and going back to the previous session, I think there are some things that were rightly said there too that we can bring to this one as well. I think the first issue that from my view as a classic parliamentary monitoring activist in a way, I think when we think about monitoring at the pan regional level or at the local level, I think and we need a couple of facts, or we need specific tools, because otherwise when we approach our government institutions, the informalities tend to be what is left of the exchange or of the conversation. And I think Africa is really, really well positioned to use the tools that are already present, and in some countries really, really advanced. I think many others can follow, to use these tools, have the facts, the evidence, and exchange from civil society with the parliaments in that direction. So we have, I think, in the world, and this is something that we've exchanged extensively with Sami, and I would want to point to that I think could be really, really relevant for the Pan-African level. One is the going into the granular or more details about the previous presentation. One is the use of the indexes. So how can we measure the performance and the transparency within the parliaments, or at whatever level? And there are tools that we can use to measure that. And when we have that, then the exchange with that institution is more concrete, and we can change or advocate, let's say, for that change in a more concrete way, or in a more factual way. And as you may know, there is an old or a classic legislative transparency index that has been applied in Latin America since 2012. And this year, 2021, is the 5th time that the parliaments, or not all of them, but 13 of the Latin American parliaments will be measured through this tool. And so if you apply it, and then you can go and advocate to those institutions what strictly needs to be changed. And I think that's the first step into saying, you know, this is the factor of change, or through this we can start the conversation of the change. And I think going to OGP, or the Open Government Partnership that Theo was mentioning earlier, as you may know, it's all about creating or co-creating between civil society and the governments action plans. And as you may know, the parliaments also have the ability to create parliament action plans. And these are a set of commitments that civil society and the parliament co-creates together and have to be implemented in the
Is this thing done, Annie?
We have a feedback. So if we're able to use those plans through the co-creation process, or if we're able to use the indexes that are available in the world, I think the step forward in the direction of transparency of these institutions that will then create transparency policies will be in the direction of be met. So I think that's one point, to use tools that are available to be able to monitor and to be able to get the facts. The action plans, as you know, are evaluated, and then we can get effectively what was implemented or what wasn't. Then the second thing that I wanted to mention too is sort of how to connect. So we talk a lot about open government or transparency, and then we see it in many parts of the world, how to connect that agenda with that seems in some places far away with the day-to-day agenda, with the problems and the debts that we have today in Africa and in many other parts of the world. We have really democratic or problems around our democratic systems. And this year and last year, we've seen it really, really concretely too. So all the problems around democracy and you know, in that big bag, we can include civic space, or we can include human rights, or the reporting of the genocide or the atrocities that have happened in our countries in the past. And some people have asked in the chat around corruption and around revenue management, etc. I think there's an interesting conversation there to connect both the democratic issue around all these very concrete and the open government agenda that can be sort of joined, and those points can be or those dots can be joined. And I think it's on a civil society side in a way to be able to change that conversation or to convert that conversation so that it's meaningful for our communities and for our societies. Sometimes many people from the grassroots movement say, you know, that's a middle class problem around transparency or around the data or around a specific platform that you want to put forward. Let's connect those agendas and let's make it meaningful. And I think through the tools and through the co-creation processes, that means dialogue between civil society and the government, and I think that can happen. And it has happened actually in many parts of the world. And I think we can use those to bring it to our contexts. I think if someone was mentioning earlier about Africa being the last continent in transparency, I think from my perspective, it's not like that. I think there's many interesting things and advances happening in Ghana, in Kenya, in Nigeria, in Uganda, in South Africa. I think those examples at the national parliaments can be taken into consideration, into bringing other countries into that debate, and also at the Pan-African level. I think I'll stop here and allow maybe for exchanges and some questions that are happening in the chat. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so very much, Maria. I think that those are really amazing points that you put out there. Of course, we are very much aware of the feedback. Of course, we are very much aware of the impact that the Legislative Transparency Index within the Latin America has made. And of course, we're happy to announce that for us at Parliamentary Network Africa, together with partner parliamentary monitoring organizations across the continent, and of course, with the support of Maria and her team at the Directorio Legislativo, are working very hard to see how such, you know, index initiative can be introduced for our continent and various national parliaments and even parliaments, you know, so that we can measure the level. Am I still audible? Level of transparency and openness on the continent. So that's a very great point that you you raise out there. And of course, while we are on the call, this is a process that we all need to put shoulders to the wheel. We are very interested. We've been doing some great work with the PAP CSO Forum, and of course, parliamentary monitoring organizations across the continent. And this will be one amazing way forward. Thank you for bringing that up. And of course, the co-creation process. I see how in the chat box, there's been a number of comments around, the need to work together between civil society and government, the need for constant dialoguing and working together. And I think that, especially at the Pan-African Parliament level, this is where the PAP CSO Forum comes in, and the effort at bringing us together so that we can engage. We are hoping that indeed this would translate into relationships at the national level. I see a few comments in the chat box. Many of them are comments that are kind of reinforcing the positions that have actually been made and calling still for the need for us to work together in this regard. I also see some comments that is looking at what happens after today. I know that if there is one thing you can be very sure about with the Pan-African Parliament Civil Society Forum, it is that the next steps of communique and the key pointers that were raised will be put together beautifully, will definitely be submitted officially to the Pan-African Parliament. And of course, there is a monitoring mechanism with Bonolo and her amazing team that will be looking at how these things get included into the process. And the PAP CSO Forum is not a one-off thing. It happens regularly, so we are able to measure where we are on things and how far the last conversation have gone. And so you can be rest assured on that. Those are the main real questions that I see that relates to this particular session. I am sure that we would have some of the other questions which I know would relate to some of the other sessions, and may even come up with Bonolo addressing them from the perspective of the forum coming up, and also being very mindful of time. I would invite Theo to make some few closing comments, of course, trying to address maybe if he has noticed anything within the chat box that requires some addressing. Then I'll do same for Maria, and then we would call it a break for this particular session. Theo, over to you.
Thank you, Sam. I think because of time, I saw a comment that I would like, just one comment that I would like. That I would like to speak on. I think I'm very sure this question might have come from the Pan-African Parliament in terms of the budget monitoring and how they can, how the question around the budget. I think they are a lot of examples that we could share with the Pan-African Parliament, but I think the most important, the first part is for the Pan-African Parliament to disclose its budget. I think it's very important and it's very critical in formats that in open data formats that people can look at. Civil society citizens can easily access the Pan-African budget, from the revenue, but also from the expenditure side. Right. And I think we can always work with them and with partners that are experts in this in terms of how do they open up the budget. I think South Africa has a very good example of a platform called Vuleka Mali, where the Vuleka Mali platform that was a collaboration of civil society and government. It was actually civil society and government came together to develop this platform where budget information is disclosed, and civil society can analyze the budget information, can actually use the budget information. So I think that is the starting point, because in disclosing the budget, you're creating space for civil society, for citizens to be able to monitor how, to create spaces where civil society can monitor the functions of the Pan-African Parliament. And again, as an example that I gave of what we are seeing in Estonia, is all the scripts and the decisions that would have been made in the Pan-African Parliament committees need to be disclosed in formats that people can look at and can read. And I think transparency is the beginning of openness and opening up the Pan-African Parliament, but also in terms of helping create a much closer partnership with civil society, because then civil society are empowered but with information that is provided by the Pan-African Parliament. So I thought I would just address this. So I think, again, I think the final thing I'd like to say is let's grow this partnership, let's work together, let's find ways of sharing information and working together to actually discuss some of the challenges that we're facing as a continent. And I think the Pan-African Parliament is really well positioned to champion some of these challenges and make sure that they push back on some of these challenges that we're facing as a continent. Thank you, Sammy.
Awesome. Thank you, Theo. And Maria, if you notice anything in the chat box that catches your attention, which you may want to take advantage in your closing remarks or any general closing remarks, over to you.
Yes, thank you. I think two things, generalizing some of the questions. The first is maybe to reflect a little bit and very briefly, because we don't have enough time, but then if you want, we can exchange through Twitter or whatever platform that you find better. I think the first reflection for me is that the power or the beauty of parliaments, I think, is twofold. Many attributes, but I think two are really, really relevant. The first is what we're talking, so the ability of civil society to engage and advocate for a cleaner, in a way, or more transparent or more open parliament. But I think the second one, maybe we don't use it as much, and it was expressed in the chat, and that's why I bring it. I think that the other side of the same coin is Parliament's ability to create legislation or to create rules, or what we call the parliament action. And I think that's the interesting side of parliament, because if it's not only that we have to advocate for the parliament to be open in itself, to be able to create an agenda that is meaningful for the community or the country that it is in, but we need to concentrate on that agenda, on the agenda that the parliament puts forward. And I think that can only be made, and this is the second point, or it can be made more deeply, more profoundly, of course, with the intervention, in a way, or with the participation of civil society in that ideal, which is, we find it nowhere in the world, but we need to get there in a better shape, in this co-creation, exchange, or dialogue, right? We need parliaments to express through their product, which is the policies that they create, what our communities need. And by doing that, we need to address all the issues that are that we talked today and that are expressed in the chat. All the human rights abuses, all the corruption and obscurities that all of our countries have, the memories of the genocides, of the atrocities that they have done in the past. We need to advocate for that agenda in a partnership way. And that is done. There are many examples in different parts of the world, and that can be done with a really strong civil society that has facts and that does this in a sustained way. Usually it doesn't work so much when it's one time and then you get tired or lost and then you come back. It's really more effective when it's in a sustained way. So just that, and we can exchange whenever you have all my data. Thank you.
Amazing. Thank you very, very much, Theo and Maria. I think that it's been a great session, one that has brought to the fore the fact that despite our continent being challenged in many ways, despite the challenges that happened at the Pan-African Parliament recently, there is still a lot of great opportunity for civil society collaboration with the Pan-African Parliament and member parliaments towards advancing the cause of the citizens of Africa. And we can do this through deliberate efforts. Proposals for the index has been made, which has already started. working together as parliamentary monitoring organizations and civil society on the PAP CSO forum have been indicated. Maria has spoken extensively about continuous efforts in this regard, and not a touch and pick situation of parliamentary monitoring, and also evidence-based advocacy towards supporting Parliament and its committees at its work, which is also to the center or at the heart of what the Pan-African Parliament CSO Forum has been established to do. And I think all of these things will be put together beautifully, together with the recommendations and the suggestions from the earlier session, into the communique that gets released at the end of this. I thank you so very, very much, Maria, for joining us very early in the morning from Buenos Aires, and for you, Theo, for joining us also in South Africa. I joined from Accra per the program, because we wanted to make room for a little bit of saving on the time we lost in the beginning. There is room for a little off-screen break. We've been behind our screens for some time now. It's only healthy that we take a little bit of off-screen break. I think 5 minutes should be good, because we've already lost out on some time. During this period, there will be some video rolling on our screens on the work that the PAP Civil Society Organizations Forum have been doing with the Pan-African Parliament. And so it may very much interest you to take a look at it. Take a stretch. While you take the stretch, do well to engage with the video as well. And we'll return in 5 minutes, which would be 15 minutes past the hour from wherever it is that you're joining us from. Thank you so very, very much. My name is Sami Obien, and I'm happy to have joined you for this. Over to you, technical team.
Just to say, part of the, okay, here's the video. Can you hear anything?
Hello. Hello. Bonon and team, are you there?
Yes, we are on a short break.
Okay, all right. I was trying
5
to.
minutes.
So we're in a break for 5 minutes. Okay, that's fine. Thank you.
Did you get my message? I sent you a message on WhatsApp.
Yes, I got the message. So I'm waiting. Once the break is done, then I will dive in with the next session. Thank you.
Okay. Arnold? Arnold?
Yes, Panolo. I can hear you. What's up?
He's taking a long break. We're going to lose people.
Hello.
Hi, Arnold. I think we can begin the session.
Okay.
Hello.
Yes, I can hear you.
Hello. Hello.
It's hello. Can you guys hear me?
Yes, we're able to hear you, and we can now see you. Thank you, Arnold.
All right. Okay. Thank you very much.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yes. So I hope that 5-minute break was
We can
worth
see you as well.
Okay. Yes. All right. Okay. Thank you. Let's just begin the last session of this CSO forum, and I'm glad that we've had a very meaningful conversation from the last panelists, but also it kind of triggers us in more specific discussions that we need to be looking at. And my session really focuses on business and human rights, and one of the key issues that really are happening on the African continent. So I will, and I do have two panelists that will drive the conversation. One is Dr. Benjamin Traoli, who is the coordinator of the African Coalition for Corporate Accountability, and his focus of discussion will be really looking at the adoption of the international legally binding instrument on transnational corporations and other business entities, looking at the genesis of what is happening, but also why we should care as the African continent on issues to do with the binding instrument. But we shall also look at a research paper soft launch that will be, that was commissioned by Publish What You Pay. And one of the key, so we shall look at a broad, I'll say a soft launch of the research paper, which will be undertaken by Ms. Fatima Mimbire, who is a journalist, human rights defender, and transparency activist based in Mozambique. And they will be able to share findings and recommendations from the research on fair share, shining a light on the extractive industry's fiscal regime in Mozambique, Tanzania, and Uganda, the three focus areas. But more importantly, and what will kick off the conversation by Dr. Benjamin on the binding instrument is one of the key issues that we've been looking at, and how do we strengthen accountability mechanisms when it comes to issues to do with business and human rights and corporate accountability. And one of the key evolving provisions that we're dealing with is the binding instrument on business and human rights. Many people know, or many people are aware about the UN guiding principles on business and human rights, but the voluntary nature of the framework is what triggered a whole lot of discussions that was spearheaded by Ecuador and South Africa on the need for a binding instrument on business and human rights. And I will not go into details of that discussion because Benjamin will guide the conversation. But one of the key things that we have continuously highlighted when it comes to issues to do with business and human rights is the involvement of the African states, but also other stakeholders in the discussions, because it's really important to look at some of these issues that are evolving, looking at conversations around criminal liability across the value chain, but also issues to do with free, prior, and informed consent when it comes to engagements on business and human rights. The other key issue that we will be probably have conversations around is the issue around the primacy of human rights when it comes to investment agreements, but also the complete conversation that's critical to understand why human rights should be a prime component in conversations around trade and investment, and not look at it from a more contractual perspective. So at this point, and I know we are pressed for time, I will request Benjamin Sir Benjamin Traore, the project coordinator for the African Coalition for Corporate Accountability, to lead the conversation around that. And after that, we'll have conversations with Ms. Fatima on the issue around the issue around the extractive industry and the component, focusing on countries like Mozambique, Tanzania, and Uganda. But for the start, let's have a conversation with Benjamin Traore. Benjamin, you have 10 minutes to guide us into this conversation around the Treaty on Business and Human Rights and what it means for the African continent. So take it away. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you a lot. I hope you can hear me.
Yes, we can hear you, Benjamin.
Great. Thank you very much. I have a few slides that I would like to share with the audience. Thank you very much, Arnold, for the introduction. And for the sake of time, I won't go into any details in terms of my own presentation. I think I will just go straight to the point. I was asked today, and I'm very happy that we have been asked to join this conversation. Thank you, Bonolo, and thank you to the Center, which is also, by the way, our host institution. So I was asked to speak around the treaty process, the process of adopting a treaty on business and human rights. And to be more precise, and as Arnold mentioned, the whole idea was when this process was kicked off in 2014 to look at an international legally binding instrument. So it was not clearly said that it was a treaty, but discussions have evolved in a way that we are looking now at the adoption of a treaty. So most of the time you will rather hear people speaking about a treaty on business and human rights instead of using the right, the precise expression which would be an international legally binding instrument on multinational corporations and other business enterprises. So I will just give a few contextual and background elements. I will speak very quickly on the relevance of a treaty on business and human rights for Africa. I will turn after that to look at the way Africa has been engaging with this process so far. I will touch upon the challenges, and I will finish by a few remarks and ways forward. So, in terms of background, the treaty process, as I said just early on, was started in 2014 after the adoption by the Human Rights Council, the United Nations Human Rights Council, of the resolution 26.2. And that resolution was quite clear in its content, because it was made clear that the resolution wanted to establish an open-handed intergovernmental working group on transnational cooperation and other business enterprises with respect to human rights, the mandate of which shall be to elaborate an international legally binding instrument to regulate in international human rights law the activities of transnational corporations and other business enterprises. So the resolution, as Arnold mentioned early on, was initiated actually by South Africa and Ecuador, and the resolution was supported and voted for by a good number of African states and states from the global South. I will show you the votes in a bit. So after the adoption of that resolution, the intergovernmental working group was established, and so far the working group had 6 sessions, and 3 draft treaties were released so far. the zero draft in 2018, the first revised draft in 2019, and the second revised draft that was released last year in 2020. And that was discussed in October last year during the session, the 2020 session of the Intergovernmental Working Group on the treaty process. So very general in terms of the content of the treaty, the draft treaty. The second treaty draft was very well received by many civil society organizations, including ours, the African Coalition for Corporate Accountability. And it has been considered as a more improved document. Many issues that were at the core of the civil society demands were taken into consideration in that draft. Issues around free, prior, and informed consent, issues around gender sensitive provisions in that treaty, issues around access to information, issues around the protection of human rights defenders, important issues around due diligence, corporate human rights due diligence, issues around jurisdictions. So it's a good draft, we can say, and it's certainly something that is ripe for negotiations. So what is the relevance of this treaty, the proposed treaty for Africa? So there are many reasons why one could think of the need of a treaty, an international instrument such as a treaty. And in this case particularly, there are many reasons, but I have decided just to present here three main reasons why we think, especially from an African perspective, that it's a very important to adopt, at least to engage meaningfully in the treaty process. The first one is the need to fill a regulatory gap that exists in that field. The second one is to give back to African states their policy space to regulate and hold corporations accountable for their business-related abuses. The third one I would mention very briefly is the need to ensure access to remedy for right holders and communities. So in terms of the first reason why I think and why we think in general as civil society organizations that a treaty is necessary in that field is the need to fill a regulatory gap. So for a very long time, business and human rights were two complete separate worlds. So multinational have operated, especially in Africa, somehow in a complete impunity. So issues around labor's rights, environmental pollution, right to health, communities' right to development, land issues, corruption, corporate capture have always been associated to business activities in Africa. And so far, there is no clear binding instrument, binding regulatory framework that govern this conduct and that address these issues. For a very long time, there was quite nothing until the earlier 2000s, where it was the rise of the concept of corporate social responsibility, a very elusive concept that actually counts more on the voluntary commitments by corporations. And obviously, conceptually, it was wrong because in a way it was it's tend to say that human rights corporations actually are giving making favors or charity in respecting human rights. And evidently it was deceiving, because you cannot count on such voluntary commitments to create actually binding obligations on corporations. And then come the UNGPs in 2011. Arnold had mentioned the UNGPs are relatively known. I think in Africa it's even not that much. Many people do not know exactly what are the UNGPs, but let's say that it was a set of guiding principles that were supposed to, to recall state duties in the protection of human rights of communities and individuals, but also some guidelines to corporations in terms of their actions when this action impacts human rights and the environment. So the second reason why a treaty would be important is to give back to African states some room for policy space in terms of, deciding to adopt measures that can help, that can hold actually corporations accountable. So many of us here are already aware of the fact that there are many asymmetric relationships between our countries and multinational corporations, but also the countries that these multinational corporations are coming from. And for a very long time, we have been asked, especially African countries, to open our countries to business in sort of obsessional quest for investors, and this idea of private-led economy. These are amplified the concern that I'm talking about here, because obviously the power imbalances and asymmetric relationships make things in sort that our states are losing or have lost their ability to use the policy space to regulate actually corporate conduct. Many African states have entered into unfair economic deals and bilateral investment treaties, and we think that a treaty on business and human rights would be an opportunity to level the playing field and impose harmonized rule on companies to respect human rights, including the right to development. So very, very quickly, I have spoken about the power dynamics here and the fact that our states have lost the regulatory space in many, to a large extent. Many actually multinational corporations have taken or lodged complaint against African states, for instance, just to give some evidence that our states are in a situation where they are bound by many kind of international economic and bilateral investment treaties that somehow limit their ability actually to regulate the conduct of corporations, especially multinational corporations in their domestic space. So the third reason that I have mentioned is the need to ensure access to remedy to affected right holders and communities. So there are many barriers to remedies for business-related human rights violations. These barriers range from, corruption, corporate capture, access to information, lack of access to information, in fact, attacks against human rights defenders, gender-based exclusions, jurisdictional issues in host countries, but also in home countries, as well as at the international level. So we do think that, again, the treaty or the proposed treaty is meant to look at these issues and to provide answers for. So let me turn now to the third point of my presentation, which is the involvement of African countries or of Africa in general in this process. So I will here distinguish between the states, African states involvement, and on the one hand, and the civil society involvement on the other. So when it comes to the states' participation in this process, to be very straightforward, the picture is very mixed, and if not even disappointing. So the African state youth have taken the habit to take part in this process quite individually. For the 3 or the 4 first sessions, they were able to make a general statement on behalf of the African group in Geneva. Last year, during the session, which was in an hybrid format, this general statement was not even made. But beside the general statement, all African states would participate or engage. Those who are present in the room would engage in discussions individually, which is quite problematic. So in terms of statistic, only 18 African countries were in the room last year. 27 in comparison to the year before, and 23 for 2018. So this shows you a little bit how involved African states in Geneva have been in this process, and I think the picture is quite concerning. So beside even these numbers that I'm giving here, when you look at the concrete contribution in the conversation in the room, this is even more concerning, because there are only a few African countries that actually take the floor in the room, that make comments on the draft provisions, and that make actually concrete proposition in terms of influencing the content of that instrument. And I'm not putting all the countries in the same box, but this is the general feeling that one can have from the discussion. Some African countries have been an exception to that. One can cite South Africa, obviously, Namibia, Mozambique, and other African countries that have been very active in the discussions in Geneva so far. So this picture is paradoxical because this treaty is very important to the continent. It's clear, it's self-evident that being the continent where we receive so many multinational corporations, and where so many human rights and environmental violations are linked to business activities, so there is even no doubt, no hesitation as to why this is a very important process, and why we should be engaging more in this process. But also, the factual reason is that in 2014, when the UN, the Human Rights Council was adopting this resolution to kick off the process, obviously many African countries voted for that process. So what are the reasons? Very briefly, probably lack of interest, political and economic pressure from Western states or China, corporate capture, pressure at the domestic level by some corporation in order to avoid or to prevent African countries to engage meaningfully. But let me go very quickly. I am going slowly but surely to the end of my presentation. I know the time is limited. The civil society has been there, unfortunately, for some reasons. Many African civil society organizations could not or cannot take part into the conversations. But as you know, for some negotiations around human rights instruments at the UN level, civil society organizations are allowed to be part of the conversation, even if states are the main stakeholders here, especially when it comes to this treaty process. And the African Coalition for Corporate Accountability has been there. Together with other African partners, we have a growing movement for the adoption of a binding treaty in Africa. And there are many other organizations, a few other organizations to be correct, that are also taking part in the process, either individually at the UN, like ACA does, but also in the way that sometimes they join other coalitions, international coalitions. We have also seen some human rights institutions that national human rights institutions from Africa that have taken part into the conversation. What are the challenges? I think there are two main challenges. The first ones are political and the second ones are legal. So just to give you a picture, before even talking about the political challenges, this was the resolution that was adopted to engage or to initiate the treaty process. You can see the states that have voted for, those that have voted against, and those who abstain. So you will see that the first category, those that have voted in favor, are only countries from the global south. And those that have voted against, you will see against, it's mainly countries from Western countries. And that shows you and that tells you a little bit about what are the power dynamics around this treaty and what are the things that are at stake. Obviously, Western countries do not like this treaty process really, because obviously it's going to add a level of constraint to their corporations that are operating abroad, especially in Africa and in global south countries. So this tells you about the challenges politically. So that has manifested itself in a way that there is a lack of meaningful engagement by many Western countries. There is a kind of discredit of the process also, sometimes even a threat of reprisal, for instance, by the Trump administration, extreme pressure by some countries to discourage meaningful engagement by global south countries, especially African countries. So new initiatives also that tend to water down the treaty process. I will not go into details. If there are questions, we can deal with that at a later stage. I'm mindful of time. There is also a big concern politically today around the leadership of the process. So just to put things in context, since 2014, Ecuador had played a very important leadership role in this process. Even if the process was started and initiated by Ecuador and South Africa, Ecuador had played a very important role. But today, we are a bit concerned because there were elections this year in Ecuador, and the new government is probably not as enthusiastic as the former one around the treaty process, which raises concerns around the leadership of the process and how this will continue. So just in terms of very briefly, Arnold, I know just in 2 minutes.
Yes, Benjamin, in a minute wrapping up, because I also have a follow-up questions to that conversation here. Great.
Legal issues, there are a lot around the content of the treaty itself. I will just mention one here, the scope of the treaty. This has been a contentious issues between the states in the negotiation room. Certain states want the treaty to just be focused on multinational corporations. This tends to be global south countries. And those of the Western states that are taking part into the conversation wants it to be broader and to also cover any business enterprise. So these are a lot. There is a lot of discussion and contradiction around this. There are many other points I will just skip to my concluding remarks. I think the treaty, to conclude, the treaty will not be a panacea. It would be naive to think that a treaty will end business impunity and business-related human rights violations in Africa. But the treaty is a crucial instrument that will help to curtail at least corporate power and to constrain corporation and to be a tool that is used by communities, a legal tool used by victims, communities, to access a remedy. So there is a need, a very urgent need for African states to engage more in this process, to engage as a group, and to have a group strategy around the treaty process. There is a need for more leadership from Africa. I have spoken about the leadership issue so far on this process. And I think we think that countries as South Africa and other African countries can play that leadership role. If we don't, we cannot count anymore on Ecuador. Civil society organizations must engage in this conversation and actually make it a priority in their own domestic space, public space. Yes, I think I would stop, I will leave it here. I think this is a very important conversation. It's a very important instrument, and there is a need for us to make it a priority and to make it so that our government take this treaty process more seriously. I thank you so much, Arnold, for your patience. I know I went beyond time, but to be honest,
thank you very much.
That I have only 10 minutes. Thank you.
No, thanks very, very much, Dr. Benjamin, because it's really an insight, and I know some of the comments are speaking to it because of what is happening. And I didn't want to go back to you, but I needed to raise one issue that I want you to respond to in a minute before we move on to the next discussion. I know we are pressed with time. One of the things that you mentioned, the treaty is not a panacea. It's not going to address all the problems we're dealing with. But one of the questions I wanted to put, and I know in your conversation you put also, the EU pressures that we're looking at and how it affects some of the big challenges, what affects corporate accountability on the continent, because it's also linked to corporate capture, the influences financial power has over our local entities. But also, I want you to relate it to the lack of engagement, because also you mentioned it. Why is African states not involved in the treaty process as much as they should be? Because it speaks to addressing some of the critical issues that we're dealing with when it comes to corporate accountability. But also it looks at creating more remedial mechanisms when it comes to abuses and violations of corporate actors. And I want to bring in, because we see it the same, beyond the binding treaty on business and human rights, we are seeing also conversations around conventions around the right to development. And I will say that session was happening 2 weeks ago, and we only had 5 African states involved. The usual that you've mentioned, Namibia, South Africa, Egypt, Burkina Faso, and Egypt, Burkina Faso, South Africa, Namibia. So you have the same people getting involved in these conversations, yet the impact of their the discussions around that could speak volumes on what happens on the African continent. Why are we not getting involved? But also, how do we push? And I want to place this within the conversation that we're having within the Pan-African Parliament. What do organs like Pan-African Parliament and other African Union organs do to influence legislative frameworks that speak to issues that are affecting the continent, but also ensure that conversations that are happening on the international stage are contextualized, are critical to addressing problems that we are facing? Where do we go from here? And this speaks to the organs of the African Union, but also civil society actors and other stakeholders. How do we ensure that conversations happening on the region, but also internationally, are alive to the context that we are facing as a continent, and also addressing the problems that we're having beyond leaving it to the political actors that tend to be influenced by different dynamics that don't actually address the problems. I know I've spoken a bit more, but how do you contextualize that and ensure that what we are dealing with and conversations we are having and organs like the Pan-African Parliament can meaningfully engage in such conversations to address problems happening on the continent? Thank you.
Yeah.
And I know it's long, but within a minute, maybe you can address that.
Thank you very much, Arnold. You have raised a lot of points, and you have also almost answers to some of them. So I will just touch on the issue around the role of the Pan-African Parliament and parliamentarians in general in this conversation. I wanted to conclusion, but I was really running too late. So actually, I think that this is very important, and you have made the point already. The Pan-African Parliament can play an important role here in terms of bringing this issue to the public space, to the public debate, because the treaty process seems to be something many people are so oblivious of. We don't even know in our countries that there is such a process going on at the international level, and how our countries are engaging with that process. So I think parliamentarians, in their function of scrutinizing and overseeing the action of a government, should take this issue very seriously and put before their governments, and make sure that these government actually engage meaningfully in this conversation. Because when you look at the fact that today many Western countries do not want to join the conversation, the negotiations around the treaty, it's also because there is a lack of a critical mass of states, especially from the global south, amplifying the need, their voice around the need of adopting such an instrument. If that critical mass exists, then other countries, Western countries, will be forced to get back and to be on the table of negotiation. No matter how the negotiation would go, because a treaty process is always based on a bargaining process where people will always put their interests forward. But at least we know that discussion would happen, and they can, lead to acceptable compromises. So I think there is a very important need on the side of parliamentarians to take this issue further and to make sure that it's in the public debate. Such commitment also should be taken by civil society organizations. And as we are here, many civil society organizations, I urge and I encourage everyone to look at more deeply at this process and see what can be done to make sure that it's a priority in the public space. Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you very much, Benjamin. And we'll definitely come back to you on some of the questions that are already in the chat. But in a way to combine this conversation, I want to bring in, Miss Fatima Mibire, who is a journalist and human rights defender and transparency activist with experience as a researcher in the extractive sector, focusing on governance. And this is a critical issue because it speaks to some of the conversations that Benjamin has highlighted. So as works with the CSO in Mozambique, but also as an AITI representative and coordinator of the National Extractive Industry Platform. They're going to present, and Fatima will be presenting a research paper where briefs about the research paper as on fair share and shining the light on extractive industry fiscal regimes in Tanzania, Uganda, and Mozambique. Because it's very critical. One of the key areas that we are looking at as a continent is this increase in foreign direct investment, but also interest in natural resource exploitation. So we will be having a brief, and Fatima, sorry to say, you will have about 10 to 12 minutes to present a brief executive summary of your research, but also key recommendations that will guide us in opening up this conversation on some of the key areas around extractive industries, but also corporate accountability as a whole, so that we can have more meaningful insight. So Fatima, back to you.
Thank you very much. I would be glad if I could share the presentation, but if not, I can just speak and then.
No, we can. Our technical team can provide you with the.
Okay. Okay. Thank you so much. Now I'm able to.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much. First of all, thank you for inviting us as Publish What You Pay, particularly for this honor for me to be here making this presentation on behalf of our coalition, Publish What You Pay. The study was made in 3 countries, covering 3 countries which has a similarity in terms of natural resources exploration, the fact that in the past years there is a boom registered in that countries. Our thoughts is based on the principle that natural resources development may provide employment and other returns. These are kind of positive externalities, but its principal benefit is the generation of government revenues to support development and well-being of citizens. So here, in a context where we are challenged by the low access to low capacity of mobilization of resources in our continents, the extractives becomes an alternative. So the rich mineral or rich resources countries are relying on expertise, and the potential to generate that revenues are there to fulfill even some human rights like access to water, sanitation, good education, good health care, and so forth. The assessment there is a background there.
I will request that participants please mute your mics because we have an interference with Fatima's presentation. So please mute your mics so that we can have a more clear output from Fatima. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So in terms of context and background, we recently saw the wave of oil and gas discoveries in East and Southern Africa in the last 15 years. In Uganda, for example, from 2006, were discovered reserves of 6.5 billion cubic feet, of which 1.5 cubic feet is recoverable. In Mozambique, from 2010, we discovered 100 trillion cubic feet of natural gas, and we became the 3rd African country with the big reserves, and the 14th largest in the world. Tanzania in 2010 also made discoveries of 57 trillion cubic feet of gas. Out or beside of natural gas, our countries also have other minerals. Mozambique particularly has a coal, has a heavy mineral sands, rubies, and so forth. Tanzania has a gold and so forth. Some other countries have graphite and so forth. The Tanzania long mining store only place with gemstones, is focusing on gemstones. Discoveries of natural gas created inputs of return for extractive sector as a whole, and reforms were made during all these 15 years to assert the permanent sovereignty, giving legislative power, the group of parliamentarians to review the existing contracts in some countries, not all of our countries, and creating high national content requirements. Unfortunately, these reforms are not being felt in our countries because of a lack of a political will to implement that. In Mozambique and Uganda, we have also reforms, but the applicability of these reforms are limited because of some clauses within the contracts that do not allow us to implement some of them. In Uganda, in terms of the contribution of expertise, in Uganda, so far earned close of $1 billion in capital gain taxes. Mozambique received 1.5 billion in capital gains and is now are receiving an investment around 20 billions in investment in the petroleum sector, and this is considered now the largest in Southern Africa, even in our World Africa project investments. Tanzania's sector contribution to GDP is 5.1%, and in 2018 and 19, according to the ATI report, 1.8 billion were released. Recent discoveries has potential to bring the positive impact in our economy. As I said, we are in a context of limited capacity of resource mobilization due to this international economic crisis. COVID came and deepened that crisis, but these potential depends on several factors. For example, the ability of our countries to generate the revenue. So the fiscal regime here plays a very important role. The revenue management itself, in cases where the state already earned some of that revenues, the effective regulation. I used to say that we in Africa are not called resource scarce, but we are affected by what I call, and some other scholars called, institutional curse. So this is everything to do with the effective regulation, the respect of environmental and health safeguards, also the issue related to the energy transition ongoing that will affect our production in our countries, and we are silent about this, and also the impact or negative impacts came from the COVID-19. In terms of the ability of countries to generate revenue from extractive industries, it's important to mention that the fiscal regime plays a very important role because sets tools and instruments that determine how the revenues from oil, gas, and minerals will be shared between companies and the state. Unfortunately, the excessive discretionary power that the state has to negotiate bilaterally with the companies are reducing that space for the state to get more share in terms of that revenues. And because of that, we decided to run this study in the 3 countries to see and evaluate the effectiveness of extractive fiscal regime. And for the case of Mozambique, we focused on natural gas fiscal regime in Golfinho 2 project, which is run by Total, and now is suspended due to the insurgency in that area. In Tanzania, we focused on mining. In Uganda, we focused on oil. And the objective is to support the advancement of equitable and transparent fiscal policies in securing a fair share of revenues. In terms of the overview of extractive industries in 3 countries, we see that the 3 countries has a tax-based tools where the corporate income taxes played important role. The capital gains, which are a kind of extraordinary tax or source of revenue for state. In our case, particularly in Mozambique, is the result of the sales of assets from where we get more than $1.8 billion in the last 5 years. Also, we have the withholding taxes on dividends, interest, professional and contract fees, and also stamp duties. And if we compare the 3 countries, we see that the corporate income taxes in case of Mozambique is higher than Tanzania and Uganda, but they are almost in the same level. But for the case of the projects that we assessed in Mozambique, the project is benefiting from will pay out of this 22%, they will enjoy a reduction of 25%. So in that regard, out of 22%, they will pay 24% during 8 years. In terms of capital gains, for case of Mozambique, we tax in a rate of 32%, but Tanzania has a different modalities for residents, non-residents, and gains share disposal. And in case of Uganda, the rate is 30%. Withholding tax, in case of Mozambique, we have also some discretion. We have for dividends 20%, interest the same, for royalties also 20%. But for the projects in Ruvuma Basin, the government provide to them a reduction for 10%. So they will pay just 10% out of this 20% that was supposed to pay. In case of Tanzania, there is 5% for dividend paid by listed companies, 10% for non-listed, 10% for interest, 55% for residents, and 50% for non-residents. In case of Uganda, is more simplified, 15% for non-resident and 6% for residents. In terms of stamp duties, in our case, is not applicable in Mozambique, but in Tanzania is 1%, and Uganda is 1% too. Looking to non-tax based too, all countries has a royalties, which is paid under the production payments. The bonus payments, in our case in Mozambique, the bonus is paid only on the production, when the production starts. Some other countries include signature bonuses. In our case, it's not applicable. We have local government levies, institutional payments, contributions and fees, states share in production. In case of Mozambique, we have a scale which starts from 15% for states and 6% to state, 15% in the earlier years or at the beginning of production, and once the production is increasing, the state keeps with 66% and the 44% for the company. So meaning that at the beginning, the government will receive only 15% and the company will live with the 85%. And once the production is increasing, the share will be divided under 60% for state and 40% for the companies. For Tanzania, there is a 50% and 75% for the state, and is 16% in all mining projects. The state participation in Mozambique is assured. In case of Mozambique, the minimum is 10%. In Uganda is up to 20%. So the minimum in Mozambique is 20%, but we can hold 50 or more depending on the negotiation. It's important to mention for the case of Mozambique, the state participation is payable, meaning that in the exploration phase, the companies care the state, so the state does not pay, but in case of discoveries, and once they progress to development phase, the state pay for its stake in terms of investment in that phase of development, and also pay retroactively the amount invested by the company in its behalf. So this is important to mention here, because for us, this is not a good way to ensure the state participation, because this becomes a cost for states, which erodes the state capacity to collect more revenues, because there is a high cost in terms of getting resources to participate. Just for you to have an idea, we are having an investment of $20 billion and we hold a 15% of stake in that project, meaning that we have to pay our 15% under this $20. And this is the amount that is about what our GDP is a lot of money. So we don't have a way to sustain our state participation. So we need to look at carefully. There is some countries that are using a mechanism where the state is free carried in all the phases of the exploration of the resources. In our case, unfortunately, we decided on the ban. On details on non-base tax tools, we have royalties. For the case of Mozambique, we have 6% under the law, but the companies are paying just 2%. Tanzania, the rate is from 1% to 6%. In Uganda, it's 2.5% to 15%. So there is discretionary power of the government that you can see over here to decide if they will give 1%, 2%, 3%, or 6%. it should be clear within the law that the royalty rate should be this percentage and not giving them discretionary to negotiate in a non-clear mechanisms. In terms of bonuses, we have bonuses that comes from $5 million to $20 million. In case of Tanzania, there is no, it's not applicable. For Uganda, we have 5 million in the first 50 million barrels of oil equivalent, and $3 million in additional 25 million of barrels of oil equivalent. So this is more technical, and we have this institutional that we see that they are different in our countries. And that tells us a lot about the asymmetry that the African countries has in terms of their fiscal regime. And that's the reason why in one of our recommendations is that the African countries should consider the possibility to create a kind of a model fiscal regime that is uniform for different countries. I understand that some countries will say that this is a matter of competitiveness and so forth, but we can compete among each other, not giving them facilities in terms of giving the companies facilities in terms of fiscal payments, but providing them other facilities that are important. For example, access to energy of inequality, access to water, access to trained human resource, access to infrastructures and so forth, not harming our capacity to collect revenues that we are offering the companies. That is a kind of a bonus for them, is not something that is really, really needed. So what we concluded on the effectiveness of the fiscal regime is that averagely this is robust and comprehensive, but is undermined by the general weak cost recovery and audit functions. In case of Mozambique, for example, we lost from 2015 and 16, $33 million, but according to some independent assessment, probably we had missed $7 billion from 2007 to 2014, where the state do not audited the costs of the companies, meaning that the companies can recover even the costs that are not eligible to be recovered according to the costs recover agreements between the companies and the government, and also according to the law. The Tanzania overstated the costs of $176 million, Uganda $29 million ineligible. In terms of illicit financial fall risks, they are there. And there are examples that we can bring here. The African Barrick Gold declared losses but paid dividends in Britain, did not remit 81 million in form of withhold on dividends. In case of Mozambique, we recently had Total buying the Anadarko's asset in Cabo Delgado, and they paid out of this 33%, they paid 23% of the capital gains tax under unclear circumstances. And we made the noise to ask clarifications about that. In Uganda, we have operations of oil companies through Dutch subsidiaries, which cost to the country more than $280 million in withhold. So we have mistakes and compromise in past contracts. So the fact that we provide the company's stabilization clauses, the mechanisms from where any change in the law is not applicable for these projects, the reforms that are made in fiscal regime are not applicable, the fact that the contracts are kept hidden are also affecting the effectiveness of the effectivity of the fiscal regime. So in terms of recommendation, we shaped the recommendation for 3 groups. One of the group is the AU, the Pan-African Parliament, where we want to underline the need to strengthen the mechanism for compliance with state reporting mechanisms in respect to extractive industries, human rights, and environment. The need to enact a model model law in respect of fiscal management of extractive industries. And here is important to consider the contract transparency as a priority. There is no argument to keep the contract secret. This secrecy is against the citizens and not against the companies or competitors between the companies. There is no sensitive commercial information within these contracts. The sensitive commercial information we find within the development plans and so forth, not in these main contracts. So there is no need to keep them hide. So we need to consider as priority the contract transparency. We need to consider to turn the African mining vision into a legal binding instrument. Now is a voluntary. I would ask the participants, how many of you are engaged in discussions of implementation of African mining vision? And African mining vision focuses to transform, to use extractive industries as a vehicle to transform our economic and social situation. And that is not happening in our countries, unfortunately, because this is not a binding instrument, unfortunately. We also need, as Africans, to develop a model double treat agreements for African countries, because we are very harmed because of this double tax agreements, and these companies operating in our countries are using these agreements to prevent payments of fair tax. Also provide technical support in renegotiation of existing contracts, and by country incorporating conflicts earlier warning mechanism in management of extractive industries. Here is important to mention, because extractives is directly associated with the idea of conflict. We are now in Mozambique being affected by a conflict which is based on resource management. To finalize this point, I would like to bring here the importance to the AU and the PAPs to be leading the assessment on illicit financial flows from extractive industries. We found out that some legislations in our countries are creating a context where the illicit financial flows can happen in a legal way with a legal guarantee. So we need to have them assessing that. And finally, we would like to have the PAPs to be leading the discussion on how these climate change agreements, the Paris agreements particularly, will affect the future of our extractive industries. As I said at the beginning, we are relying a lot on the revenues coming from these sectors, but they are now moving, that some resources will be shut down, meaning that we will be very severely affected. So what is our plan as Africans? What our government has to say about this? What is our plan, our strategy? So for me, it's important to have them engaged, leading the discussion on that and shaping environment from where the citizens and the governments sit together to discuss the future. How do we move forward? How do we prevent our countries to be harmfully affected in a context where the resource mobilization capacity is very reduced? So I will start from here. Yeah. I will be sharing these slides afterwards. Thank you.
Yeah, no, thank you very much, Fatima. I think we're being pressed with time, but I also, following the comments that are coming in from the participants, everybody is impressed with the presentation, and there's a lot of interest in your PowerPoint, but also the research itself. I think it can go a long way to interest, but also influence civil society engagements in the conversation. One of the key issues, and there's a lot that we can discuss on the matter, on the discussion around extractive industries. But one of the overarching issues that we really need to critically think about is the issue around access to information to some of these agreements, but also some of the, especially the power sharing agreements, because civil society engagement in the sector, but also other stakeholder engagement in the sector is only effective and can only be influential if we have the right information around some of these agreements. I think from the publish what you pay conversation that you're having, but also the research that you've done, how do we, and I think in 30 seconds probably, how do we strengthen this access to information when it comes to the extractive oil and gas sector, but it's extractive industry sector, because our involvement as civil society, but also as interested stakeholders, can only be effective if we have the right information. And I think it's a lot of conversation that we can have on this point. I know we are pressed with time, and I want to throw this back to Bonolo to kind of bring, because there were a number of questions that were being shared within the chat around the Pan-African Parliament involvement, but also the interest on this conversation. And hopefully we can come back to you to think about that and share a more enlightened point around access to information, because for me, it's one of those things that cuts across in a lot of conversation that you're having within the EATI, but also the publish what you pay engagements. So I will throw it back to Bonolo to kind of address some of the key questions that were coming in from the Pan-African Parliament perspective and involvement, but hopefully we'll get a minute or two to come back to Fatima and Benjamin to wrap up this conversation, especially around issues to do with the binding treaty. But Fatima, importantly, the important question around access to information. How do we get the right information to be effective in our involvement and engagement with the state? So Bonolo, back to you, and then we can probably come back to Fatima. Thank you.
So Arnold, it looks like I'll be doing the closing remark. So I think just finish this session with your questions, and then I'll answer because essentially my answers to the questions that have been brought forward about the CSO forum are part of the closing remarks and giving the way forward. So I'll suggest that you finalize this session and take questions from, questions from the audience and answers from Benjamin and Fatima, and then we'll close.
Okay,
so I'll come back after the...
Fatima, I know we are already pressed with time, but for me, that important question on access to information, let me get to you within a minute. What do we do around access to information? And how do we keep participants in this conversation?
Yeah, well, we have different mechanisms. I know that some countries have the law of access to information that enable citizens to access to information, and its applicability is not effective. The other way we found is that EATI is an important mechanism or tool to provide information to citizens, not only because of the report itself that is annually, but because of the kind of information that is required. Even the contract transparency is there already. The beneficial ownership, who are the owners of the companies that are operating in our countries, who from our countries are involved in that consortiums and so forth. So taking advantage, adhering to such kind of instruments or tools can be useful. And one of our recommendations for our government is that joining EATI in a perspective that you will have a tool from where you will be shaping the access to information to the citizens. But in other hands, it's important to recognize that the parliaments are the main source of information for the citizens. All the discussions about the natural resources exploration, about the politics are made there, and as our representatives, the discussion of the main things should be there, and from there the information should go to the citizens. The civil society is doing its part. We in PEP do not have access to information, to contracts, but we managed to buy some contracts in some websites and we put them in public domain. From that, we managed to have government putting other contracts in public domain, and then we got from the parliament legal guarantees for transparency. So using that platforms that exist can be useful. Adhering to EATI, it can be. I understand that some countries are very reticent to join EATI on the idea that EATI is to control the information from our countries, but there is a positive externality that you find a tool from where you can share information with your citizens. EATI is more than that.
Okay, thank you very much, Fatima. And I know we're pressed with time, like I keep on saying. Benjamin, I don't know if we still have you online. There are a number of questions that came in within the binding treaty process. Dr. Benjamin, do we still have you online?
Yes, yes, I'm here, Arnold.
So there are a number of questions that came in within the chat, and I really want you to, within also a minute, to address the conversation around with Africa now at the helm of the World Trade Organization, but also there's a specific question saying, you know, what can a process initiated by Africa bring about a people's accountability mechanisms on the regional basis with the aim of complementing the binding treaty process. So I want you in a minute to kind of, can we push a more African-driven accountability mechanism with, let's say, like they say, with Africa, the helm of the World Trade Organization, but also having South Africa as a key proponent for the binding treaty initiative? How has that influenced the conversation, but also how can we leverage its being to ensure that we have an accountability mechanism that speaks on the regional issues and context that we're dealing with?
Yes, thank you very much, Arnold. And yeah, I think these are key issues, and probably we should continue this conversation. I'm so sorry that we are pressed by time and we cannot have more space, more room for discussion. I would just like to, yes, in terms of how does it impact the fact that at the World Trade Organization we have now a new chair, which is who is an African. I think it's interesting, but let's also not be too optimistic about this. And as I said before, corporate impunity, actually, the treaty even would not be a panacea, in the sense that corporate impunity is embedded in more, global issues, issues around corporate power, issues around neoliberalism, and so on and so forth. So I think we can use that space, obviously, if the persons that are concerned are willing to. But I think also that the second point of your question, how in Africa we can make sure that we have a legal framework that is even more developed and stronger, this is something we should also and we can look at. And in that sense, I think let's not forget that the African Commission has developed a number of instruments on extractive industries, for instance, but the African Union in general is working today on a policy framework on business and human rights. All these are opportunities for adopting new regulations on the continent, but also strengthening those who exist. And I am not even mentioning here at the sub-regional level. When you look at the ECOWAS, for instance, there are many instruments that have been developed with a binding effect, by the way, that can be also utilized. So I think here there are many efforts that needs to be put together, not only at the legal level, not only for legal instruments, but also at the political level, to make sure that this is an issue that is put in the public debate. So I will leave it here. I know that Bonolo is stressed with time. I will leave it here, and Arnold, I think we can continue this conversation with our partners, our friends. I think this is a continuous discussion that we are happy to continue.
Thanks a lot, Dr. Benjamin. And you're right. This is a conversation that we'll continue having. And I know we cannot have all the time we need. But I know there were a number of questions that came into the chat, but also key is the sharing of the presentations. And I promise our participants will be able to share the presentations both from Dr. Benjamin and Fatima with the participants. But now back to Ms. Bonolo to address some of the key questions that came in, especially around the PAP engagements, but also the CS Forum, and how we can leverage that platform to influence conversations around broadly human rights advancement, but also corporate accountability. Bonolo, back to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Arnold. Just briefly, I'll speak on the CSO Forum in particular. For those of you that you're joining the CSO Forum event for the first time, the Center for Human Rights is in partnership with the Pan-African Parliament, and part of it is to ensure that there are formal mechanisms of engagement with the Pan-African Parliament and civil society organizations. So we've been doing this for the past 3 years. We've hosted meetings like this in Kigali in 2018, and one at the POP in 2018, two in 2019. And of course, we couldn't do anything last year. If you remember earlier, we spoke about the fact that the POP could not seat last year because of COVID-19. The rules of procedures had not been amended to allow them to meet virtually. Now, to answer some of the few questions that have come up, one of them, a practical one about how to join the civil society forum. We are going to keep your details in our database. But you can send an email if you either want to join the forum as an individual or as an institution. You can send an email to me, and I'm going to ask Tiruna to just put my email address on the chat to everyone. You can just drop us an email and indicate that you want to be part of the CSO forum, either as an individual or representing your organization. But even if you don't do that, the technical team will give us details and will add that to our database. But as a way forward, there are 3 things. I mentioned earlier that we've commissioned a study, an evaluation study on the Pan-African Parliament performance over the past 16 years, just looking at its contribution to the African Union governance architecture and how the PAP has fulfilled its mandate or not. Dr. Bonolo, who presented earlier, is at a process of finalizing this study, and we will launch the study in July. So we do want to extend an invitation to you when we launch the study, because what that means is that once we look at the report and the analysis that has come out of that, and he has done this through research. So it's a research-based evaluation study where he had done interviews with Pan-African Parliament members, the secretariats, members of the African Union, and civil society. So we'll look at that report in detail and explore avenues for us to come alongside the Pan-African Parliament and enhance its capacity to ensure that it fulfills its mandate. So we'll communicate that to you in due course. And in terms of the Malabo Protocol in particular, we have just developed a toolkit that looks at, it's an advocacy toolkit with 2 target groups, civil society organizations and members of the Pan-African Parliament, that looks at advocacy avenues and campaigns on the ratification of the protocol. So one of the things that we want to do is to support the campaign, the Pan-African Parliament campaign on the ratification of the protocol with members of the Pan-African Parliament on domestic level, but also we want to do a campaign as civil society organizations. But before we do that, we're going to gather a group of experts. Will have a roundtable discussion with a few members of civil society organizations to take this toolkit that we have developed and really look at it in details to figure out some of the stuff that Dr. Nyobe spoke about earlier, the implications of the ratification of the protocol, and what will that look like for the continent, and what will that look like for the Pan-African Parliament. And so we will send an invitation to that to anyone who may be interested and may have this expertise to contribute to the working group around the ratification of the Malabo Protocol. And lastly, something that is immediate. either tomorrow or Friday, we will release just a brief report of this discussion to all of you. And in addition to that, we want to put together a joint statement from Civil Society Forum that will go to the Pan-African Parliament. Again, like I said earlier, that we just don't want to be hosting these dialogues and not actively engaging with the Pan-African Parliament. So with what's happening at the moment between now and August, with the Pan-African Parliament being governed or led by the secretariats, there are a lot of opportunities there for us as civil society to come alongside the Pan-African Parliament. But as a starting point, we're going to put together a joint statement on issues that have emerged out of this conversation. So if any of you, and I've seen in the chat box as well, there's a lot of meaningful comments that have been made, a lot of meaningful questions that have been brought forward. So I want to extend an invite to you that if you do want to contribute to this joint statement, you're more than welcome to send a paragraph or two to myself and mention the institution that the statement is coming from. Again, if the statement is coming from your organization, mention the name of the organization. If the statement is coming from you as an individual, you do that. And hopefully by the end of next week, we would have finalized the joint statement with all your contributions, and that will go to the Pan-African Parliament Secretariat. So we'll address that to the clerk of the Pan-African Parliament, as he's the one that's currently leading the institution. But just to say that we host events like this on the sidelines of the Pan-African Parliament Ordinary Session. Obviously, with the happenings of the past 2 weeks, we couldn't do that. And hence, this has become a post-ordinary session. So we will have another meeting in August. And beyond having a meeting like this in August, we're also going to have some capacity building with different committees. At the moment, it will most likely be the Committee on Human Rights and Justice, the Committee on Gender, and the Committee on Rules, Privileges and Procedure, and International Relations and Corporations. Again, if you do want to be part of this work, so this is not the work of the Center for Human Rights. The Center for Human Rights is a secretariat of this work. This is a work of African civil society organizations. So we are making a call that you're more than welcome to come and join us as we enhance the capacity of the Pan-African Parliament. So I'm going to hand over to Colette. And just from my side, I just want to say thank you so much for being here. I know that this was a really long meeting, and I see when we started, we had about 180 people, and now we've got 80 people. So I just want to say thank you to the 80 that is here, for being here, for engaging, for asking questions, for making comments. We really appreciate it. And I always say that this work is still in the infancy stage, but I imagine that it will grow into something bigger, and you would have the privilege to be a part of that. So from the Center for Human Rights, I just want to say thank you for being here. And I'm going to hand over to Ms. Colette, who's a chairperson of the steering committee, to just also say thank you from the steering committee's point of view. Just 2 minutes and we end the meeting. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Bonolo. I would like to thank the Secretariat, to thank the speakers, to thank the participants, those that are already in the civil society forum working on PAP, and others that are potential members. I would like to really express my appreciation for the convening of this meeting, because it is so timely, especially after the terrible events that happened last week, that not only embarrassed us, but that demonstrated a total breach, of the duties, the functions that are aspired by the citizens to be fulfilled by the Pan-African Parliament, a very important body that we have in the continent, with a very unique mandate of oversight, legislative oversight. We know that we have arbitrary laws, we have very bad laws in our countries that are not in harmony with the objective of the AU Constitutive Act. So if PAP is not acting on its mandate, for example, making sure that state parties are legislating laws that are in line with the treaties, with the conventions that are adopted, then we'll continue to see breakdown of the rule of law, continue to see reprisals, persecutions of human rights defenders, people who are speaking, promoting the very same rights that are enshrined in the treaties that member states have adopted. We are encouraging all of us, to change the way we've been doing things. I think the situation of last week has challenged us to even be more robust, more organized, and to promote the Pan-African Parliament and find ways of making it visible in a way that promotes the rights that are enshrined in the treaties. One of the significant role of the Pan-African Parliament is to ensure that the treaties that are ratified are domesticated and there's implementation. We have a treaty like the Maputo Protocol, for example, a treaty that I realized that when the violence was taking place last week, that most members are not even aware that they are the custodian of these treaties. They are the ones who need to ensure that gender-based violence, no harmful practices or conduct, are subjected to women in Africa. They are the ones who are supposed to be emulating this to ensure that this protocol has got laws at national level. Citizens are able to access remedies from the very protocol that state parties are expected, to protect rights of women, even the vulnerable groups. We have spoken about all the challenges that we are facing. However, we have these mechanisms and PAP rules of procedures as well. Article 72, it provides them an opportunity, to be visible, to work with civil society, to even conduct under Article 22, to conduct hearings. Citizens can engage PAP, they can listen to some of the violations of human rights that are happening in the continent. So if PAP is letting us down, then I think we will regress than to progress in the continent. When the AU adopted Agenda 2063, the aim was to ensure that before even they adopted that agenda, it was to ensure that all treaties in the continent, all outstanding treaties that have not been ratified are ratified. We have a number of state parties that have not done. We have the African Court on Human and People's Rights. How does the AU enforces, litigate, ensure that citizens access the courts? For example, we have very few member states that have signed Article 34.1, where citizens can actually take the matters directly to the African Court. And we know that countries like Tanzania, they withdrew. We've seen all these patterns, of lack of accountability. And this is where we need to have PAP at national level. I think it will also be important to have forums that monitors the parliamentarians that are nominated or elected to participate at PAP level, so that we engage, we consult with them. We don't just see them appearing at PAP in mid-range level and then nothing happens on the ground. So we need to close all these gaps, because if they are not seen to be accountable, it is because we are also failing. We are also not putting our structures on the ground to ensure that they account. When it comes to issue of gender equality, I understand that the Malabo Protocol is going to bring in far-reaching results. We can see that there's only a representation of one woman amongst 5. Out of 5 parliamentarians coming from each country, one of them is a woman. We are encouraged by the increasing of number, but 2 is still does not give us 50-50. Maputo Protocol is talking about gender equality. Maybe we need to encourage them, as they have the power to develop guidelines that will ensure that, maybe they should do a rotational basis, that if this year there were 2 ladies, there were 2 women parliamentarians, next year we can say after 5 years, it will be like 5 male. I think that process we need to monitor. Otherwise, we'll continue, complaining about gender-based violence, complaining about all the problems that our continent is facing, and where human rights defenders operate in fear. We need to see a PAP that is independent, a PAP that is dedicated, to promote all the treaties, all the laws that we have in the continent. I don't have enough time. I know that Bonolo had asked me to speak for 2 to 5 minutes. The statement that we're going to produce, we really encourage you to bring in some of the contributions that we think will make the process very formidable, very effective, because if we fail to be robust, this is where such actions that we've seen, the attacks that have happened, will continue. I also wanted to talk about what is the point that I wanted to raise? Oh, it's unfortunate. Within the SADC region, I wanted to bring the issue of SADC tribunal, the economic communities of the AU, that if PAP is not respecting those regional economics as well, you know, it's going to be very difficult for AU to come up like they were raising their voices, asking that the AU should come and manage the chaos that was taking place. We have, SADC was so close, is a state party, I mean, it's a regional body that could have even intervened, because actually the crisis, they were the ones that were raising, that were finding that the process was not open, there was no transparency, there was no accountability. And when ECOWAS was raising issue around Mali, I think that in itself, it gives credence to ECOWAS to have been raising and have made a decision which was very, very important. And the fact that AU took up a decision few days after ECOWAS had already made a decision, and ECOWAS is a regional, it's one of the RECs, which is part of the organs of the African Union. So we at the civil society, we need to ensure that we understand how the AU functions, its mechanisms, and how the PAP relate, because the PAP is functioning under impression currently that there is no visibility, there is no knowledge, nobody speaks about their function. And we need to change the way we do things and to make sure that the work that we do is visible. I recommend as well that we have a campaign, a similar campaign like we had with the AU Charter on the
Okay, it looks like we have lost Colette. Okay, yeah, it looks like we have lost Colette, but again, I just want to say thank you. Yeah, you'll hear back from us in the next 2 days, either tomorrow or Friday. We will send just a short report and then we'll give a detailed one in the next couple of weeks. But thank you so much. Have a great day and thank you for your patience. Bye-bye.